Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're about to start the afternoon session, and the Minister is here ready to give us his opening address. So could I ask you all who's sitting or standing, would you please take your seats, and for the people from outside to come in. Okay.
Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for coming back promptly after lunch. I'm absolutely delighted that Minister Eamon Ryan is joining us this afternoon. As I'm sure you know, he is leader of the Green Party and has been since 2011. He is also Minister for the Environment, Climate and Communications, as well as Minister for Transport, has been since 2020. He has been a TD for Dublin Bay South since 2016 and previously was TD for Dublin South between 2002 and 2011. So please join me in welcoming Minister Eamon Ryan.
Security, and I nearly tripped. Good afternoon, everyone. I very much appreciate the opportunity to make a contribution as leader of the Green Party, as TD for this constituency of Dublin Bay South, but also in a personal capacity, reflecting, I think, this process needs to be an open one. It needs to be one that hears every voice and respects each of them. Fifth province type meeting where you can come and treat different views with respect. And I believe this process has been important. And the fact that some 1,000 people, as I understand, have taken part in the 4 days, that some 300 people have already made a submission online, which I think is the most important and encouraging development, and that I would encourage as many people as possible to do the same before that portal closes, I think on the 7th of July next, so we listen to each other with respect, regardless of the views that people bring to it. I come from a Green perspective, Green political perspective, and I want to just very briefly first frame how that, I think, our political philosophy, how we see this issue of military neutrality in the history of our party. Green parties set up all over the world roughly at the same time in the late 1970s, early 1980s. Ireland, for the Ecology Party, was set up in 1981. Teacher Christopher Fettis putting an advert in the paper saying if some people or two people share certain values. I had a great privilege of meeting Christine Milne, who was one of the leaders of the Tasmanian Green Party, which I think was the first. They were protecting some of the natural forest and parkland in Tasmania. And as I said, I had the great privilege of meeting her some few years ago when she simply set out some of the underlying principles of our political party, the philosophy that inspires it. There might be, you might call it, 4 legs in the table of green political thinking. Firstly, it's a recognition that the ecological crisis we face cannot be ignored. It has to be our first priority to try and stabilise and restore the natural world, to stop the ongoing destruction that's taking place, which hinders all our security unless we achieve that objective. Secondly, a belief that in restoring ecological justice, we need to bring social justice at the same time. We're not separated from nature, but we do have an opportunity at this time in restoring nature to improve our own political and social economy. Thirdly, it believes in participative democracy, constitutional democratic democracy, trusts in people, believes in engaging to the lowest of decision-making at the lowest effective level. And fourthly, and perhaps most importantly in the context of this forum and this gathering, we are a party that comes with a pacifist perspective in the world. We were formed out of the movements such as C&D and the wider anti-war movements that were there in the late 1960s, civil rights movement that spread right across the world. And that remains our political philosophy today. And I would argue it also extends, and needs to extend at all times, to the way that we deal with each other, treat each other in politics. Pacifists not just in opposition to war, but also pacifist in terms of how you go into politics with a respectful position towards others, even if you may disagree with their view. Christine Milne said that the philosophy spread from Tasmania at that time across to Sydney, where there were trade unions were involved in protecting some of the green places in that city. They wore green bands to designate the campaign or to show their campaign. And as it happened, Petra Kelly, German Green Party, then they were called Ecology Party, saw those green bands and decided that's why it would be called a Green Party. She brought that home to Germany and it spread. Petra Kelly was very connected to Ireland for a whole variety of different historical reasons. That history, that tradition, that outlook frames how we see this issue in terms of military neutrality. And such neutrality is absolutely at the heart of our party today. We are and remain opposed to NATO membership, seeing all the difficulties and downsides that we believe that would bring. We stand for the United Nations, the Charter of Human Rights, and that approach of multilateral cooperation, constitutionally derived and devised to deliver on objectives. Such military neutrality, though, doesn't mean that we should be unable to defend ourselves, if anything, the exact opposite. And nor does it mean that we're politically or morally neutral in the face of unprovoked aggression. It does not mean that we pursue a policy of strict impartiality, but rather that we focus all our knowledge, experience, policies and resources to promoting conflict resolution and global justice. Firstly, with regard to that issue about being able to defend ourselves, we absolutely recognise, and we have a particular responsibility as a party of government, in government at this time, that our defence forces need the resources and the ability to respond to the various threats that exist in cyber, at sea, but particularly maybe when they're on peacekeeping missions abroad. We support high-quality training for our defence forces so that when those forces do go on peacekeeping missions, they can benefit from having the best access to top-quality guidance and equipment. We wish to strengthen their capabilities in what some people call soft power, an area in which Ireland has real strength, and where we can be much more impactful if we follow it in a structured way. I believe our neutrality can become a recognised badge, and is already a recognised badge of legitimacy that's highly important in an increasingly polarised world. We continue to believe in a triple lock for the deployment of Irish peacekeepers abroad, but the triple lock which does not have to lead us at the mercy of an increasingly disruptive Security Council veto system. As I said, our party believes and tries to live out in our day-to-day work in participative democracy. We have a particularly strong culture of developing our own policy positions from within the party, from having it completely open to all members. We have a very effective and active and strong policy council. And last April, using that process, which followed very detailed analysis and engagement that people with an interest in the issue had contributed to a new policy, it was agreed by the party unanimously a new position on neutrality, which includes a new, progressive and more flexible triple lock proposal that means that any decision that we take as a country in this regard has to A, be approved by Dáil Éireann, has to be reviewed and approved, similarly approved by Shannon Éireann, and must be either supported by a UN, Security Council or General Assembly resolution, or failing such a resolution by decision of a regional organisation or by regional arrangements encouraged under and consistent with the United Nations Charter and the purposes and principles of the United Nations. That's key. Examples of such regional organisations are the African Union or the European Union. I set out in my own contribution to the Dáil debate on this issue last month exactly how that triple lock might work, and I believe it could provide a very useful tool for us to get agreement and make progress in terms of how we make sure that our defence forces can be involved in peacekeeping activities in a way that's in tune with the reality of our present day, particularly a reality of our present day of a world that is at war and where there's real threats and risks that we have to help resolve in the wider world. I want to set out just a brief discussion on some of those if I can. I have a particular interest as Minister for Communications, Climate and Energy among my portfolio, and I might just, if I can, focus on some of the risks and some of the threats that exist in that area and what some of our responses should be. Firstly, with regard to cybersecurity, and I had a meeting with Richard Brown, our Director of the National Cybersecurity Centre yesterday. We were just in Cabinet today, approved the mid-term review of our National Cybersecurity Strategy. We all know the scale and the nature of the risk there, having seen the attack on our health services in the very critical moment during the COVID crisis. We were completely disabled by a ransomware attack which effectively closed down a lot of our health service systems at the time we most needed. So this is a real security risk, one that we cannot ignore, one that the government is responding to with very significant increased resources being given to the National Cybersecurity Centre and making sure that it works in close collaboration with the Garda Síochána and with the Defence Forces so that we're able to protect our people from what is probably the most significant risk we face. We're lucky by dint of geography to be a less likely target for any land-based or even air-based attack by another regime. But in terms of cybersecurity, that geographic advantage does not exist. If anything, we're even more at risk because we're such a significant country for the storing of digital material and also such an advanced country in terms of the use of this technology with one of the most advanced telecommunications network systems in the world. We have a real urgent need to make sure that those systems are safe in a world where they are under attack by a whole range of different actors. The second risk, if I can, on energy security is also very real. In a world where we're seeing the use of energy or the deployment or the sharing of energy or the sale of energy being used as a weapon of war. We all know the threat that existed to Europe, which has not yet passed in this war in the Ukraine from the cutting off of the gas that Europe had become dependent upon. I had the great fortune, I've been elected co-chair of the International Energy Agency as we face into our 50th anniversary, a meeting of which will take place in February next year. I was in Paris 2 weeks ago for a meeting of the International Energy Agency. I was in Paris again last week at a summit organised by President Macron on the issue about how we address some of the climate risk, which I might speak to shortly. But I make one point, and I think it's an important one when it comes to the issue of energy security, that as we transition a world away from fossil fuels towards the renewable, efficient future, that is actually the best security protection of our time. We will never go to war over renewable power. You will not be able to hold a country to ransom by saying, follow our ruling or else the solar panel gets it. It is a different characteristic energy system, less energy dense, but more ubiquitous and distributed in character. And it has a different nodal distributed system, which means we shift away from the hierarchical control system that fossil fuels and nuclear have brought, which also have brought us in train so many resource wars over my lifetime. We can all cite the examples and the damage that has been done in that regard. So the development and deployment of renewable power, in my mind, is the great peace project of our time. I said to the IEA is, our security now is not going to be defined by how many barrels of oil we have in store. We will have to keep them for a period as we're weaning ourselves off the fossil fuels. But our real best security, and the security for everyone, will come when each country has access, as every country does, to such renewable power supply systems. It is a similar issue on the climate side, or there's a similar clear connection on the climate side. As I said at the start of my opening words, the biggest security risk we face, bar none, is the ongoing burning and destruction of our planet, which has been caused by the use of those fossil fuels. Our military personnel are good at assessing and monitoring and managing risk. So military systems increasingly across the world are realizing this is the biggest security threat. In terms of how we manage and how we address that, I think it's particularly important, and I said this at the summit in Paris last week, which President Macron organised, that we make sure that our neighbours' climate security is protected in everything we do. In a world which could easily move towards a conflict between superpowers on energy and climate, America, Europe, China, India, the path to peace, in my mind, will be instead in green cooperation in the access to the energy efficiency and renewable technologies, so that the developing countries in the world, which are under acute stress at this moment because of the high energy prices, because of the problems of coming out of COVID and the significant debt problems that they all have, as well as the impacts of climate change, which is adversely hitting the developing countries most and first. Our solution there has to be in making sure that they have access to the solar, battery, and other technologies which allow them to have access to energy, which half the developing countries in Africa, developing communities in Africa don't have, but also which provides a stabilization not just of the climate, because if they don't meet their targets, none of us will meet our targets, but also by having such a stable energy system, that also delivers and provides one of the most important peace projects we have, or one of the most contentious and difficult issues, how we manage the significant migration we're seeing, and which is likely to accelerate if runaway climate change continues. That's the best way, rather than a Fortress Europe policy, in my mind, a working with neighbours policy to make sure that their energy systems evolve rapidly in this low-carbon way is the best way of us maintaining their security, and their security in turn helping ours achieve our own. And I know that's very broad, it's very, you might call it, say, aspirational, but the costs would actually be a fraction of what it would take to take a military, closed-border alternative strategy instead, in Muhuram. Thirdly, in these other threat areas where I have particular interest as Minister for Communications, and I had the great privilege a number of years ago to be involved in the International Grand Committee on Disinformation and Fake News. It's what I was reading one of the documents this morning described as hybrid threats, but threats that are real. We saw it in Cambridge Analytica. We saw it in my mind a number of different elections across the world, where we've seen the cornerstone of our security, our constitutional democratic systems, being undermined by the use of the new social media and other internet technologies to destabilise and undermine countries from a distant location. This is a hugely critical and an important issue, and one that we cannot ignore if we're talking about security. It was very interesting, as I said, the first event took place in the House of Commons as a result of the work that they were doing looking into the Cambridge Analytica scandal. The second one was in Ottawa, where the Canadian government had a similar interest due to concerns as to what had happened in their direct elections. And I was very proud that we in the Oireachtas held a third such meeting in the Shannon Chamber some 7 years ago, if I recall, 6 years ago, if I recall rightly. It was very interesting in the detailed, lengthy discussions we had there as to how do we protect ourselves from this threat. I think Anya Kerr at the very end put it best when she said the best way about protecting against the tendency of the algorithms of this business model in the social network companies to feed people what they already believe, to try and accentuate what they already are interested in as a way of maintaining a lock on their attention to be able to sell advertising, which is the characteristic of what's happening in these networks. And as a result of that, feeding people what they already know or feel, an increasingly polarised political system. We can all see that in our everyday lives when you watch what's said and see how people treat each other, even people who know each other, treat each other in a remarkably offensive way on some of these networks. Anyway, Anya Kerr's antidote, and particularly antidote where those systems and those algorithms provide or promote false narratives, are often fake information, conspiracy theories of a whole variety of different genres. The only and best way of protecting against that is actually investing in high-quality journalism that's able to present people an assessment and analysis of what's really happening in the world, what's true. I mentioned that today because I don't know what time it is now, but I know RT are due to make a statement shortly on some of the absolutely scandalous details of what's been uncovered in the station. But just one point I'd make, and I think it's important, that in all the investigations we need to do on that, and the condemnation which would be correct, based on whatever findings arise, we have to be careful that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We have to be careful that we retain the really proud service that RT has provided this country in public service broadcasting and other media. It's not just public service broadcasting, it's all our newspapers, radio stations and other media provide us a really important, in my mind, security service. Because they allow us to assess what's happening in the world in an impartial and educated and informed and critical to the highest standards journalism have always had way. And I think while that may sound a bit of a tangent or a bit far from some of the discussions that no doubt have taken place in the last 4 days, I think it's an important part of the architecture we need to maintain ourselves as a stable, secure, neutral country in the world. Lastly, as I said, we do this in collaboration. We collaborate in the area of cybersecurity to try and find out what is the malware that's coming our way and how can we avoid it, stop it, block it before it gets here. That requires, you can't do this on your own. You have to rely on friends and allies and others to give you initial sight to what's happening. We also collaborate, in my mind, in the European Union, which is, as I see it, one of the great peace projects of our time, and an organisation and an institution which has evolved the whole political structures towards one of genuine collaboration. We do that in PESCO, but we do it in a way that doesn't go beyond the line that I think we should absolutely maintain and hold, which is our military neutrality. Yes, we need to get the best expertise in for our defence forces. Yes, we need to make sure that they have the best equipment. But we need to maintain and develop further their incredible capability and the incredible strength and benefits they've brought to this country by us being able to stand in the world in a neutral perspective and try and hold the peace. The very last line I would share is I had the privilege several years ago to attend a Joint Oireachtas Committee visit to Egypt. We were there to try and ascertain or bring back home Ibrahim Halawi. If people remember that, a young boy from Clonskee who'd ended up in prison in Egypt, and we went there to try and bring him home. We had various meetings in that regard with all the Egyptian government officials and with the variety of actors. But we ended up in a meeting, Cancorlan, about 6 of us, representatives of the Dáil and Seanad, with the head of the Arab League, former foreign minister, I think he was, from Egypt. And we went in and sat down and all the cups of tea around the usual graceful, kind of diplomatic scene. And I'll never forget what he said. He said, "You Irish are different." He said, "You Irish in southern Lebanon, when the militias came to attack the villages, you stood on the bridge and you said, 'You shall not pass.' And we will never forget that." And he meant it. That's the strength that the neutrality we've had can show. We should stick to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Ryan. Thank you for drawing our attention to actually many of the themes that we've been discussing the past few days: the impact of climate on energy security, cybersecurity, and the threats of disinformation, and of course the centrality of partnerships to everything that we do. So thank you for coming this afternoon. I'd now like to invite Conor Gallagher, who is the crime and security correspondent of the Irish Times and author of the book that we've all been reading, and congratulations to him on his timing in the publication of his book on neutrality. He is going to moderate the next panel, and I'm hoping he's just on the other side of the door. There he is.
History and development of neutrality since the history of the state. It's an honour to introduce my panellists. Michael Kennedy, who is with the Royal Irish Academy, and he is the Executive Director of the fantastic resource, the Documents on Irish Foreign Policy, a lot of which are available online and for free, and I'd encourage anyone with any interest in Irish history in this area to look at them. Beside him in the middle is Dr. David Murphy, a lecturer with Maynooth University, a military historian and a prolific author. And beside me is Dr. Kiva Nick David, senior lecturer in modern Irish history at the University of Sheffield. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. You've probably all heard this before, so I'll keep it brief. The forum operates in a spirit of openness and inclusive consultation. So please keep any contributions respectful and avoid personal criticism. Please keep your contributions brief, less than 2 minutes, and please keep them on topic. Bear in mind we have a session on the future of neutrality directly after this. We're going to spend half the time, so half an hour, talking up here before the next half an hour going to the floor. So we'll be taking questions from the floor and from Slido. The instructions for Slido are up there, I think. And you can also like questions and give thumbs up to questions that you'd like to see answered. With that in mind, we will jump in, I think. And since we're talking about the development of neutrality, we could go back maybe to Greek city-states or whatever, but we only have an hour. So Kiva, could I go back maybe to just before the foundation of the state? To what extent were nationalists or Republican leaders, men in 1916 or before, thinking about neutrality as a founding or intrinsic concept of the state?
Yeah, I mean, it's worth setting out the background of how this policy evolved. To kind of go back a little bit farther, of course, in the 18th, the 19th century, Irish nationalists are not really thinking of themselves as neutral. They're making common cause with all sorts of potential allies, more or less on the principle of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but also in the case of liaisons, alliances with France, with the French Republic, on the basis of a common Republican ideology. So that's the first thing I want to say. Of course, in the decade immediately prior to the revolutionary period, you do see the beginnings of some discussion of neutrality. So Roger Casement in 1913 sets out a kind of vision of a neutral, independent Ireland. James Connolly in 1914 assumes the presidency of an organisation called the Irish Neutrality League. Now, in both of those cases, of course, you have to caveat that with what they end up doing, which is making a common cause and having cooperation with gallant allies in Europe. So, it's important that we bear that in mind. But the concept of neutrality is creeping in. I think the shadow of the war, what happens to John Redmond, the very negative reaction in Ireland to Redmond's well, at least a negative reaction in Republican Ireland to Redmond's advocacy of Irish people joining the British war effort, and particularly the conscription crisis then in 1918. That casts quite a long shadow, I think, over independent Ireland, and particularly when you come around to the period of the Second World War. So that's a key point as well. But it's also worth remembering that when the Irish nationalist leaders, Irish Republican leaders, are making their case for independence in 1919, 1920 and 1921, neutrality is not always part of their arguments. De Valera, in his Cuban interview in 1920, indicates that Ireland would be to Britain like Cuba was to the United States, a sort of a protectorate, heavily aligned military bases, all that sort of thing. Similarly, I mean, during the treaty negotiations, it's quite interesting. Griffith and Collins are the ones who are trying to hold a line. They're the ones who are suggesting, no, Ireland needs to be able to be neutral in any future wartime situation. But if you look at document number 2, which is the Republican, the De Valera's all badly misunderstood. I don't think any of his colleagues understood it at the time, but that's the alternative to the treaty. There are some suggestions that there will be a sort of common defence arrangements between Ireland, an independent Ireland, and the nations associated with the Commonwealth. So I think, there isn't this kind of hard and fast cleavage to neutrality, even at the moment when Irish independence is being fought for, is being argued for, and is being secured. So that it develops as a result of international developments in the 1920s and the 1930s, in particular what happens in the League of Nations in the 1930s. But it's not a kind of foundational cornerstone, I would say, of Irish independence.
David, just moving on then, the treaty has been voted on, the Civil War has taken place. To what extent is Ireland, or could it claim to be a neutral nation in, say, the first decade of the state, when the treaty ports are occupied, the Royal Navy are in the waters? Could we have any credible claim to neutrality during that period?
No, I don't think we really could. We were still very much, we had obviously come through the War of Independence. We were at the far side of that. We were outside of our own Civil War, and we all remember this as well. There was influence coming from Britain and elsewhere about how the Civil War was going to be run and the conduct of that. But on the basis of... Sorry.
Get the microphone, David. Thank you.
I'll project. But I think in that we were very much still in the shadow of Britain. And I mean politically, we were in that kind of sense. Also financially, I mean, if you follow some of the money trail for not only just in defence in Ireland and the conduct of the Civil War, but other infrastructural issues in the 20s and 30s, we were still getting a decent amount of money from the British Treasury. So they had that certain level of squeeze on us. And then there was the territorial thing. We had treaty ports in here as well. So I don't think we could really kind of like see ourselves as emerging as... we were emerging as a new nation, but we weren't a neutral nation. We were too close. And then also, I think, coming into the 1930s, our options were becoming less and less. I mean, Ireland subscribes to the League of Nations idea. Okay, those principles. But by the 1930s, there's so many bad actors in the kind of like in the geopolitical sense. We are pressed into a position where do we kind of quietly align ourselves with Britain as best we can? And then the other possible alliances in that period are all rather dark. I mean, and there are, if you look back to particularly the early 1930s coming from Soviet Russia, and then later on the mid-1930s coming from Nazi Germany, there are overtures from those regimes all across the world to try and develop a system, an allied system that will compromise Britain and compromise the British Empire. And we don't get involved in that, obviously, which is a good thing. But in terms of actually to be able to definitively say we're neutral with naval bases of another organisation, another country on our territory, no, we couldn't do that. And then even, I suppose, from a military perspective as well, I mean, in the mid-1920s, there was a report on what the size of the Irish Army Defence Forces should be, and it's putting it in somewhere around the mid-20s. You probably know that you've come across these reports, and we shy away from that as well. So we get ourselves into this double whammy kind of position where we're trying to be neutral, we're not technically neutral, we're also not spending on our own defence, so that then means that we are reliant on other people to oversee us. In many ways, these patterns haven't changed.
Michael, did you want to come in there on that?
If I could come in here on that. Can you hear me? Because I don't think I can hear me.
Yeah. No, I'm not.
I don't think your mic is on.
I think the mic is off. Can you hear me if I project like this? Okay. I'm used to lecturing, and I think I can do it here. I think that my panelists may have downgraded. Very good. May have downgraded the aspiration, nonetheless, to neutrality in the 1920s. The document David was talking about there, the Defence Review from 1925, explicitly says Ireland will attempt to be neutral. I'd forgotten about it till I checked it recently, and I think in the treaty negotiations as well, there is a sense, some of Erskine Childers' memoranda, Ireland aspires to be neutral. The aspiration is there, but then the realpolitik is different. And when you have British forces stationed on the island of Ireland, when you have partition, and you have the treaty ports, which are not really ports, but that's not for discussion today, it is impossible to actually be neutral. But I wouldn't underestimate, or I wouldn't play down that sense of desiring to be neutral if at all possible. And the League of Nations does allow Ireland to take part in a collective security pact, although we know the League failed. And it's that move in the mid-30s, I think, is particularly instrumental. A speech De Valera gives in 1935, where he says Ireland will not be used as a backdoor by which to attack Britain. Ireland will attempt to be neutral in any future war. And that's where we get the modern aspiration of the policy, if you like. And Ireland will be neutral until it's invaded. And I think that's why I wanted to come in at this point, just to remind us all that neutrality is the penultimate step. We hope it's the ultimate step. But in defence planning, in the interwar period and during the Second World War, the emergency is the penultimate stage in the transition to war. The next stage is war. We were a lucky neutral. Think of Belgium, think of Luxembourg, and other European neutrals. So I think that's important to remember. Neutrality was a means to an end. The end was to survive the Second World War, and the end was also to show that Ireland was a sovereign, independent state, free of the influence we're talking about here. We got the ports back in 1938, free of outside influence and could follow its own destiny. But we were lucky because of geography. The Battle of the Atlantic notwithstanding. So thanks for letting me in there, Conor. I just want to give a shout out for the neutrality side to this.
Absolutely.
As well.
And Kiva, did you want to come back?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Obviously, De Valera makes that speech after the Abyssinian crisis, but by this, where he sets out an aspiration for Ireland to be neutral in the coming war. But during the negotiations around the return of those treaty ports in 1938, he is drawing up plans for a defence pact with Britain. So even at that point, it's still contingent. It's through good fortune, it's through geography, as you say, that things unfold in the way that they do. But it could have gone quite differently had the British played hardball, more hardball than the treaty ports. In the treaty ports, they realised that the treaty ports were more trouble than they were going to be worth to try and hold against the will of the Irish in 37-38, and so they folded on that. But had they played hardball, maybe there would have been a formal defence pact. It's one of these intriguing counterfactuals that we can spend some time thinking about through conversations like today.
And it's worth bringing in on that Lord Brookborough, not Northern Ireland Prime Minister at the time, but I think Minister of Commerce, says there were 2 times in his life when he was willing to envisage a united Ireland. And one of them is the Second World War. Now, he didn't say what the second one was. He says this to Norman Robertson, a Canadian diplomat. So there are so many impossibilities, tangibilities that we can grasp at to what might have happened. And that's the fear, I think, facing Defence Forces personnel and the Department of External Affairs, as DFA was then, during the Second World War. Can we get through this? Because defence planning in the 30s was appalling. Plans were drawn up for a large modern army, but the chits for procurement went in at the same time as the Munich crisis to Britain, our main arms supplier. That weaponry, which was very modern, came through in dribs and drabs. So we didn't have that joined up thinking that we were talking about this morning and through the last couple of days. That is absent in foreign and security policy conceptualization and thinking in the 1930s. And it comes back to luck, really comes back to luck. Who am I neutral against? was what the Chief of Staff of the Defence Forces said during the Second World War. And Dan McKenna, Lieutenant General Dan McKenna, knew that it was simply luck that got them through, as well as a degree of military power and effective diplomacy.
In terms of World War II, the narrative for years was that we were neutral as neutral could be. Then a kind of a counter-narrative through the work of maybe Robert Fisk and others emerged that you could say neutrality, the term, didn't apply at all. Where's the truth in it? Were we neutral in World War II? And all three of you, I'd like to, if you want to come in on this.
Can I hop in there?
You can indeed.
I was talking before we ran this session. I actually ran a war game with a class there, one of my civilian classes there before end of term, and we ended with the plan. They were tasked into this, and they had to defend Ireland in the 1940 context. We launched German Plan Green, the invasion of Ireland, and it was a very kind of like interesting hour to watch this play out. There was three teams. There was a German team, obviously. There was an Irish team and there was a Northern Irish team. And I won't bore you with the details, but when we got to the final stage, the German team started making overtures to the Irish team, and there were a number of Quislings jumped in. We actually flicked half the team. So it was an interesting context. But when you actually get into that period, I mean, we have this idea of neutrality, and that we then were allied leaning, etc., in our policy. I think when you actually get into some of the defence planning in kind of like military archives in Calbrua, you're seeing very elaborate plans being prepared here. By 1941, we've ceased to kind of like look at this kind of concept that there'll be a German invasion that we have to react to, and maybe a British invasion as well across the border. And we're moving into a greater sense of cooperation with British, and beyond that, with Allied forces. Okay, and that goes down to very distinct defensive plans for Ireland. It goes down to how we will deal with the refugee situation in Ireland. It goes down to how we will, there's intelligence sharing with British and also American kind of like agencies about material that we've captured and about things that we've seen. So we have an idea that we're neutral. I think we also have an idea that neutrality is nuanced. But when you get into the actual defensive plans, you can see that the connections were growing, quite elaborate plans being made to defend Ireland from a German attack.
But I think within all of those, the planners at the time still conceived of Ireland being neutral. There is a wonderful memorandum from the 31st of May 1941, Help Given to Britain. And it outlines, I think, 15 points of help, of assistance. And its neutrality is about pushing the envelope. Michael Rinn, the legal advisor in the Department of External Affairs during the Second World War, spoke of the trackless desert of modern neutrality law. He started with the Hague Conventions, and he said it moves outwards. And basically, we're on our own. We've got to make this one up as we go along, and we've got to push through and try and survive. And it's the diplomacy of survival. And that links into the points David is making there, the defence planning and the cooperation with the Allies that develops right up until, I suppose, D-Day, the weather forecast for D-Day coming from Blacksod Lighthouse in County Mayo.
I mean, I think neutrality was, in spite of the contingency that we were talking about just a moment ago, it clearly was a rational political choice at the time. It was rational in terms of the state's, the government's responsibility to defend its citizens as best it could. Michael and David have mentioned planning deficiencies as they existed at the time. Clearly, if Ireland had joined the war on the side of the Allies, Britain would not have been capable of defending Ireland from German air raid attacks. I mean, Britain could barely defend its own cities, its own people from air raid attacks. That simply would not have been possible. So there's a sort of, preserving the lives of the citizens aspect. But it also was a rational political choice in terms of, there clearly would have been some kind of civil war. I talked earlier about the shadow of Redmond that I think lay heavily across De Valera at that time. There was a minority Republican campaign and subterfuge and liaisons with German intelligence, and De Valera took an extremely harsh line against members of the IRA during the war, interning many of them, executing some others. But I think generally the neutrality during the Civil War and the establishment of the Volunteer Reserve, I mean, these are, they're not it's not the best equipped reserve in the country, but it's a lot of ex-revolutionary veterans, ex-Civil War veterans who at least have some fighting experience. And it sort of serves as a kind of a balm, I think, for the national for the national divisions that had existed post the Civil War. You do get ex-IRA men who are speaking together, who are joining up in great numbers for the first time. So it is a rational choice for reasons of geography. As Michael said, Ireland got away with it. But I do also just want to mention, you talked about the trackless desert of neutrality. I was reminded when I heard you say that of the old joke of the two Irish privates in General Montgomery's army in North Africa, and they're out in the desert digging a trench, and one says to the other, "Say what you like about De Valera, at least he kept us out of the war." And, but of course, that tells its own story about Irish people serving in British forces, but that's another matter.
I think you say it's the rational choice. It's the only choice.
Yeah.
Because the alternative is civil war. Yeah. You're talking about a generation who remember British tanks on the streets of Dublin. You're talking about a generation who had colleagues, compatriots executed by the British. They don't necessarily want to jump in. And what small state jumps into a great power conflict just like that? Ireland was neutral until it was invaded. That is De Valera's policy. And the invasion could come from either side. And some of the most chilling documents in the National Archives are the cabinet agendas that are still on file for the last cabinet meeting after the invasion has taken place. And they're still in their dispatch envelopes waiting for dispatch riders to take them around the country to wherever the government has gone. And they are chilling, because you realise that that is the moment that the Defence Forces are engaging foreign troops on Irish soil and Irish people are dying in the Second World War. Thankfully, it's a history that never happened, but that history really is spine-tingling when you look at those files.
I think at this remove, it's easy to kind of view it as an abstract question, but as you say, if Germany had invaded and then England or the Britain invaded from the north and we became, as Dan Bryan I think called it, a cockpit for belligerents, the horrors unleashed on communities in Ireland would have been, the Civil War and the War of Independence would have looked like a picnic compared to them. But just on that wonderful phrase, that trackless desert of neutrality, there's very little in international law that says what a neutral is or isn't. Is that right, David?
Well, I mean, we have this kind of established practice has grown up about what to expect from a neutral state, and it comes down to actions and utterances. Really, I mean, it's not being involved. It's not getting involved with overseas military adventures. It's not kind of it may be condemning actions that are happening, but not kind of like openly supporting one side or another. So we've all that kind of like sense, but also I think pretty much contingent in this, and if you see all various other nations who are in the neutral club, so to speak, globally, there's usually, it's taken for granted that you have a capacity to defend yourself. Okay, and if you're a landlocked country, that's you have a land warfare and an air warfare component. If you're an island nation like Ireland, that you have a maritime security component, and that you can defend your airspace and you can defend your ground. And then in the modern context, we were talking about it just before we came on, we have the cyber aspect again. So there's that expectation that if you are, in many ways, we're trying to play both ends against the middle in our current approach, in that we're neutral, but we're also not going to build up the levels of defence, and that's the tricky one. I mean, I'm on record for saying this. NATO, I don't think we necessarily want to go in that direction, for practical reasons about the integrity of the organisation. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, they showed ill kind of like bad faith towards some neutral states, and with things like the Operation Gladio project, and that was particularly dark. NATO is not necessarily the way to go. I think we can remain neutral, but we cannot remain undefended, because this is the shit that we've been so lucky. As Michael has mentioned, we're geographically lucky. If you look at the context of World War II, there's a whole plethora of nations that want to be neutral. Belgium has established itself as a neutral state. It's been established to be a neutral buffer zone in Europe. It is part of the German invasion plan in 1914, specifically identified as the route in. The moral kind of like censure of invading a neutral country doesn't matter.
Speak into the mic.
Sorry, it doesn't make any difference. So 1914, it's slated for invasion. 1914, similarly, the Netherlands is slated for invasion in 1914. But they do not go. Germany doesn't go into it for various reasons. Okay, and say the Netherlands Luxembourg, Belgium, you're all looking at countries that have an armed neutrality. They are putting a certain level of their GDP into this. But the Belgians not only have an army and navy and air force, they also have a fortress system. So they're spending quite a lot on defence and trying to be neutral and stay out of it. But invaded in both world wars. Netherlands invaded at the get-go, Blitzkrieg 1940. Finland is trying to be neutral in 1939. It's invaded by the Soviets. Norway is trying to be neutral in 1940, invaded by the Germans, and then there's an Allied mission intervention. Now, is that help or is that invasion? Is that two invasions? So in the kind of like the neutral space, you've got these countries that are trying to remain neutral, spending an awful lot on their defence, and they can't make it happen. And then we're having this discussion now. This is not unakin to discussions you will see both in Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands post-World War II. When they've come to this decision, they've been invaded once or invaded twice. Being neutral brings no moral censure to somebody kind of like invading you. Being armed neutrality, it actually hasn't saved you. So they're moving towards collective security and going into NATO. We geographically, I think we have a certain advantage in this kind of like concept. And so when we look at who are the neutrals now, Sweden, Finland, long-term neutrals gone. So that leaves Ireland, Switzerland, and Austria.
And Malta.
And Malta.
Don't forget
Let's not
Malta.
forget the Maltese. Let's not forget the Maltese. But in that context, I would just say, and it was one of the briefs for this panel, how do other neutral countries organise their defence? All I would say, just do a quick Wikipedia search on Swiss Army, Swedish Army, Finnish Army, Austrian Army. They gear their defence totally different in terms of investment, the architecture, the kind of like the structure around it, the ecosystem around it. But the huge advantage for the Swiss, and historically the Swedes and the Finns, but definitely the Swiss, the modern neutrals, they have geared their society towards societal defence. Okay, young men, young women are not abashed about going for military training. Look at the Estonians, 1.3 million population, and they can feel they're moving towards 26,000 of an army, but being able to activate 80 to 100,000 reservists. But everybody in the Estonian system has a role to play in defence, not necessarily in uniform, but maybe in civil defence, or just looking to their own social resilience. Okay, if something happens, you're asked to have your food in, your medical supply in, etc., etc. But roaming back, so this is a conversation that really started from World War II onwards. But that dreadful context, we were talking about staying out of it in World War II in the context of watching what's happening in Finland. Watching what's happening in Belgium, France, the Netherlands. And Michael was talking about chilling documents. I would say go into military archives, look at the planning for moving refugees around Ireland and where they're going to be located. And you're kind of going, they're actually talking like France 1940, but it's Westmeath. What are we going to do with the people when the British Army starts coming down through Athlone, Mullingar? What are we going to do? What are we going to do with the people if they do come, hit the beaches and start moving upland? It's chilling, but a very difficult space. And the neutral club getting smaller and smaller.
And the chilling documents as well are the tabletop exercises that the Defence Forces undertake in anticipation of a British invasion are terrifying. Fighting from Dundalk across into Cavan, motorised units coming across the border in the middle of the night, the Defence Forces sending out patrols to try and engage. The patrols are wiped out, falling back, holding the line of the Boyne. And it's linking in with the refugees, with the terror of the Second World War that might have been, comes alive in this. And I think post-war, there's that sense of this must never happen again. We must never be so underdefended and undefended. There's a cabinet decision taken in April 1946, and that it reads, the state will endeavour to remain neutral in future wars and to be able to defend itself. And by 1952, Frank Aiken is talking about strong forces adequately armed and equipped, air defence, ground forces, naval forces. And we can see an early iteration of the debate we're having today within that. So I think history does show us that we've been here before. And where we failed in the past was over the capacity building, the procurement, and probably the financing. As we heard this morning, defence is expensive. And that's where attempts at rearming in the 1950s absolutely failed because the money isn't there. So historically, there are plans there for an armed neutrality of a Swiss style. There are plans to bring in national service, you might want to call it conscription, in the late 1940s, but they're seen as historically unpalatable because of the conscription crisis after the First World War, and they also are too expensive. And it all comes down to finances in the economically declining, deprived years of the 1950s.
I mean, just to come back to your point, David, about both of your points about the scenario planning for a British invasion and the horror that is contained in the documents about what that might look like. One of the reasons why there wasn't a British invasion, of course, was because of partition, because the British had that foothold into the North Atlantic, which protected the sea lanes and protected trade and protected material supply and all that sort of thing. So there are some challenging questions, I think, for Irish people, for Irish governments, for Irish nationalists, in unpicking that knot that is sovereignty, neutrality, unity, and identifying where things might have changed to allow a different position to be adopted and where things are still the same. And the other thing I wanted to say is that, of course, what we haven't mentioned about how neutrality in the Second World War played out was an absolutely rigid censorship imposed by the government. And thinking about the panels that we heard earlier today about cybersecurity and misinformation, disinformation, clearly that is a situation that has transformed completely. So, there was rigid political neutrality enforced alongside the military neutrality during the Second World War, but that situation has changed enormously.
My favourite example of the censorship is the story of the picture in one of the newspapers of a minister ice skating, which was pulled by the censors for fear of giving away weather conditions to one of the belligerents. I want to go to the floor because we're about halfway through, but I want to come back to the idea of partition in relation to neutrality and, of course, NATO and the early days of NATO. But can I take a question from the floor, perhaps? I want to talk to someone maybe who hasn't spoken before. This gentleman in the front row, please.
Thank you. Dave Alvey is my name, from the Irish Political Review Group. I'd just like to make the point initially that it's been a very interesting, some comments from, I congratulate the panel on a very interesting discussion so far. Of course we get involved in the details of the various situations at particular times when we're talking about neutrality. But I think there's a core principle that stays right through, and that core principle came from Casement and was very ably defended by De Valera. And that principle was that because of our history, we don't wish to be used by the great powers in wars that had the motive of preserving their supremacy. So that's a principle that comes from that period and which, with all the talk about, that was history, it's all different now, that's a principle I think that should remain. I think also that, in this difficult national conversation, if you like, and some of the panel were speaking about the same discussion going on in other countries. I was very interested yesterday to hear the Finnish representatives say that the people supported their politicians. They had a discussion, everybody was involved, and there was trust. And trust is a big thing in the Nordic countries. So they trusted their politicians. I think that a lot of the commentary that we've had in Ireland in the last 30 years or maybe longer has been to distance ourselves from the origins of our state and the development, particularly, let's say, in the 1930s and all of that. And that has created a disconnect, and that has created distrust. So if anything is to come out of this forum, I would like the achievements in the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, and the 1960s to be acknowledged, so that it's not as if we just came out of the Irish Sea in 1973. And I think that might allow more trust, which has been missing.
Thank you very much. Just take one more from the floor, please. The gentleman here, third row back with the beard.
Sean Quinn is my name. Just from a historical perspective, It's part of our history. England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. So if we're going to have an independent Ireland and there's going to be a war, well then, England's difficulty, Ireland's opportunity, let's join with Germany and get the 6 counties back type of thing. But I've gone through the Anglo-Irish Agreement and I've looked at the thing right up to the handover of the ports. And as I see it, the security of Britain was fundamental to our neutrality. Now that's a sort of a contradiction, but by being neutral and not going against Britain in a war situation, we were helping Britain's security. And they were obviously concerned. It was a fundamental concern, their security, and that Ireland wouldn't be used to impede that. So I think, in a strange way, that the security of Britain was fundamental to Ireland's neutrality. So what's your view on that?
Just in the first question there, maybe the panel would like to talk about the questioner mentioned, our achievements relating to our history in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and I presume he was referring to maybe Frank Aiken's role in the UN and the non-proliferation treaty. How closely linked was that to our neutrality? I don't know who wants to come in there.
Well, I think I'd go back further with the questioner's point of view and look at somebody like Sean Lester in the 1930s, one of the trailblazing generation, first generation of Irish diplomats who becomes an international civil servant at the League of Nations and goes on to become League of Nations High Commissioner in Danzig. We joined the League 100 years ago this year, and the role Lester played in Danzig was to warn Europe of the Nazis, and he wasn't listened to. So I think that there are figures like that we bring out from our past. We show, Aiken is another one of them, of course, show how we have an ongoing tradition of involvement in collective security, of peacemaking. We talk about 1958 as the beginning of Defence Forces peacekeeping, but the first thinking about it was in 1934 when the Defence Forces were asked by the League of Nations to contribute, I think it's 2 companies of troops to the League of Nations policing force for the Saarland plebiscite between France and Germany. So once we examine history, once we go into history, we see so many episodes that have been written out of or taken out of the contemporary debate for whatever reasons. And when we reinstall them, I think this gentleman's point is very important. We begin to see a much richer national story that we can use to inform our current debates.
I thought this gentleman's comments of Finland were very interesting. I recently did something on the Winter War of 39-40. And Finland, post-World War Finland is part of Russia in World War I, so it's in World War I. And then post-World War I, it falls out. It ceases to be Grand Duchy of Finland. I'm not going to do a big history lesson here, Ships. And then it's a civil war. And it's quite like our own. It's actually very visceral. It's a red versus white factions. But when the Russians come in 39, it's very interesting that Mannerheim, who has been a figure of opprobrium with the Finnish left, that trust is there. For national defence, we are, you've got the factions in Finland say, look, we are diametrically opposed on various things. But on this question of national defence, we trust you, and we will behind you on this once issue alone until we see this through. So it's interesting that there was, even though it was so recent, it was so visceral and so bloody, the various elements of Finnish society could come back together in national defence mode.
Could I quickly answer the gentleman's question here? I know I've been hogging the floor. Mr. Quinn there spoke about Britain and Ireland and security. On the outbreak of the war, De Valero made it known to Edward Hempel, the German ambassador, we'd say now in Dublin, that Ireland would show a certain consideration for Britain. And that was reported back to Berlin. And that notion that Ireland would never be used as a base from which Britain would be attacked is fundamental to Irish security policy, to the Irish expression of neutrality, because of geography and because of Ireland having been seen back to I suppose you could say, the early modern period as a weak backdoor through which Britain might be attacked. Think of the Year of the French, think of other attempts to come into Ireland, the War of the Three Kings in the late 17th century, the 1690, the Boyne and so on. So it's very much in De Valero's mind as part of neutrality. And De Valero has a very complex view of neutrality. He's a very important thinker on international relations and a very important exponent of how to do neutrality in a particular format. So thank you for giving me the time to come in there. Sorry, Caoimhe.
Go ahead. No. Go ahead.
Dermot Hayes, there's a couple of very interesting questions on Slido, actually. Dermot Hayes asks, and we're moving a few decades forward in time now, how important was neutrality in the defeat of the first Nice and Lisbon referendums, and were the guarantees given to the electorate genuine or misleading? I presume it means the guarantees enshrined in the Constitution that we'll not join the EU defence alliance. Does anyone want to come in on that one? Panel of historians.
That's too recent for me.
But no, I'd say something on it, perhaps deflecting it slightly. The debate on the history of neutrality has waxed and waned and flexed using the facts of the matter. I'm thinking of like the European army. Maybe this would be something that would come in here. And I'm slightly winging it on this one, but I'm thinking of the way Ireland spoke about European defence from the moment that it first became interested in European integration in the late 1940s. And it's not unusual to hear some Irish politicians speak in favour of a European army. Frank Aiken does it once or twice, Liam Cosgrave does it. But from the other side, the sense is that Europe understands our form of neutrality. And I'm looking down my list here for a quote from Sean Lamass as Taoiseach, which I can't see. But the gist of it is that the EEC understands in the 1960s and up into the 1970s, when Ireland is beginning to apply, what Ireland's neutrality is. It understands that Ireland is neutral and that Ireland is not a member of NATO, and that is not incompatible with membership. So I'm going to stop there at that point, because that's where my expertise in it ends. I can't bring it up to the present because I'm a historian. I deal with... this is the past, but it's not the past in my lifetime. So I'm going to kick it to touch on that.
Just to come back in on Lamass's point that the EEC understands that Ireland is neutral, Ireland is not a member of NATO. But of course, in the late 1940s and the 1950s, successive Irish Taoiseach hold out the prospect of Ireland joining NATO in return for an end to partition. So again, we have this complicated knot around sovereignty, unity, neutrality that is all being that is a lot more contingent. This word that I keep coming back to than we maybe are prepared to accept today. But I think another key moment in the elevation or the embrace of neutrality, or the full-throated embrace of neutrality on the part of the Irish people is that famous broadcast that De Valera makes at the end of the war, responding to Churchill, where Churchill is congratulating himself or congratulating Britain for not having invaded Ireland, even though it would have had ample cause to do so, some such phrase. And De Valera makes a very emotional and emotive, and it's a very moving, stirring speech that is a kind of an articulation of a vision of Irish neutrality that is at the heart of what it means to be Irish and what it means to be a sovereign state. Now, of course, a few decades later, Sean McBride as Taoiseach is saying, well, maybe we'll join NATO, we won't be neutral anymore if you give us some movement on partition. So things are still moving, I think, even in the 40s and the 50s, and clearly in the 1960s, there's a belief that the European community understands, but nothing's written down in black and white either. Things can change.
Something that is in black and white and is worth mentioning is McBride's response to the United States that Ireland does not wish to join NATO just yet because of partition.
This is in 47.
This is in 49.
49. Yeah.
The second paragraph, the last line reads, therefore, with the general aim of the proposed treaty, the Irish government is in agreement. So that's where history gets manipulated and stuck basically, that McBride is saying, yes, we're in agreement with the proposals behind the NATO treaty, but we won't join until there's movement on partition. And of course, given the special relationship, this is not going to happen. But take that out of context, it looks like it could be used in one way. Read it in the context of the memorandum, it tells you something completely different. So I think history is a very contested area, and it's a very flexible field that you can work with here. And it has to be handled very, very carefully when we're looking at a topic that is as contentious and engaging as Irish defence and security policy and neutrality policy from the birth of the state onwards.
So Ireland was willing to be a founder member of NATO, if not for the northern issue.
If we're to believe the document.
But it's about weaponising the founding of NATO in order to achieve the end of partition. So you can read it that way as well.
Of course, yeah, it was a ploy that didn't quite work out.
Yeah.
And by the 60s, the government, the Lamass government, is thinking, well, in a coming war, Ireland will be neutral, it will be a willing belligerent, or it will be an unwilling belligerent, and NATO will be looking for bases in Ireland. So the debate is very, very complicated, and the planning and the contingency planning is incredibly complicated.
I just want to go back to the floor and see if anyone would like to ask a question. Gentleman, sorry, you had your hand up there. The gentleman in the green jacket, or in the green jumper.
Thank you. Am I live?
Yeah, we can hear
yeah.
you. You wouldn't mind introducing yourself?
Sorry, Pádraig Mannion. Just about the point of lack of military planning in the 30s. I think if you look at Irish history, there was no planning of any sort in the 30s. Economic planning, housing planning, any sort of planning. So military wasn't an outlier. I think also in the debate of the start-up of NATO, and the fact that Ireland was cut out of an extension of Marshall Aid because of our refusal to subscribe to the International Security Act of 1951 shouldn't be forgotten. The effect of the Lisbon Treaty, number one, was that the triple lock was written into Irish law. So whether that was genuine or not, we don't know. Time will tell. As Chairman Lai said about the French Revolution, is too early to tell on that issue. But like talking about the foundation of neutrality, surely the speech by De Valera in 55, which goes on for a bit, as De Valera's speeches tend to do, but he makes the point that if we were part of an alliance, we would not be consulted as to how a war would start, we would not be consulted as to how a war was conducted, and we would not be consulted as to how a war was ended. Which, you could take as blah, blah. But when you look at the American-US withdrawal from Afghanistan, where their special relationship with members of NATO was ignored. We're out, you make your own arrangements, lads. Maybe De Valera was very prescient in 1955. Thank you.
De Valera had a very clear view there that goes through his period as Minister for External Affairs in Taoiseach. Small states suffer in large state wars, period.
Just this gentleman here, please, in the third row back.
Thank you, David Geary, and thank you to the panel. Very, very interesting discussion about the historical context, and in the context of this history, I wonder, do we need to update our lexicon and our vocabulary? These issues that we've discussed are obviously several decades ago, and in the European context, the Crotty judgment even is 35 or so years ago now. And questions such as, what is the extent of the state? What are the limitations, extent of our sovereignty as a state? What is foreign? What is neutrality? They seem to change in the context of our shared infrastructure. We've shared projects now with our partners. We have a shared currency that we created ourselves, an area of freedom, security, justice, the single market, etc. If the European Central Bank was attacked, we certainly wouldn't be indifferent. That would be a direct attack on our own currency. So, in the context of neutrality, which I think there's broad agreement that Ireland should stay neutral, but we still, and there's broad agreement that we should defend ourselves. But who are we is the question now. So I wonder if the panel would care to comment. Thank you.
I'll just take one more from the back there, please. Gentleman. Yes, thank you.
Yesterday afternoon we had a panellist from Norway, and they explained in Norway they're a member of NATO, but they're seen around the world as impartial, and that they've actually served in 40 UN peacekeeping operations, very involved in the Colombian peace process. And I'm beginning to wonder now if a lot of our discussion about neutrality is actually about impartiality and the subtleties of that. Just maybe if there's anything going back over the history between neutral and impartiality and what it really is the difference.
Thank you very much. So just on that, maybe last question.
Yeah.
That kind of impartiality versus neutrality thing, Eva.
Well, I think that both questions are sort of coming to the same, speaking to the same issue. You know, do we need to kind of refresh our understanding of the terminology, or are we taking definitions from the 1940s and kind of excavating these fossils and continuing to impose them in our national life? I mean, for me personally, I find the distinction between political and military neutrality a bit of a cop-out, to be honest. I think, you know, if you were part of a political union, foreign policy is about war is just an expression of foreign policy, or is an expression of failure of foreign policy. But you know, given the way that threats have changed in the last 20 years, possibility of cyber warfare, you know, when notwithstanding what's happening in Ukraine, the type of conflict that Ireland is likely to face, the type of attack that Ireland is likely to face, is probably not going to be, you know, tanks on the streets or jackboots, you know, at the door. It's going to be a different sort of threat. And so I think you're right. I do agree that we do need to update our understanding of who the we is, and is there a meaningful militarily neutral we if all of our political if we are agreed that we are not politically neutral. I think that's a bit of an Irish solution to an Irish problem, and like all of those Irish solutions, those conceal a lot of hypocrisies and a lot of accommodations, or a lot of getting away with what you can get away with. So I think we need to have a bit more of a frank and honest discussion about all of these things, our terminologies, our lines that we're drawing about what neutrality means, about what impartiality means, and make sure that we're speaking with insight from history, but speaking to the conditions of today, not those of 60 years ago.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Caoimhe. I mean, the only thing I want to add to that as well, I think we should consider, I think these lines have become blurred. I mean, for so many decades, we could do the old, we're at the edge of the world, we've nothing anybody wants, nobody's going to interfere with us. We've embraced globalization, we need to embrace our security around that. And the negative of that is that in that the global world, the current world, there are other people watching us, watching our actions. Are we military neutral? Yes. Are we politically neutral? Perhaps not. Do we address every situation the same? Do we show favour? And there are bad actors out there, and we all know who I'm talking about, who are obviously watching how other nations are playing out. So I would say we need to consider that, flick the mirror to the other side. How are people on the other side looking at us? Okay. And just as a concrete example, we probably all tuned in, or we caught Vladimir Putin's 1 hour history lecture, or hour and a half history lecture there last February, justifying, and there's a person with a totally different take on the world, total different take on world history. You know, he would not succeed well in any of my exams, but there he is. And he perceives the West as being a threat to him. He perceives Russia as being in conflict with the West. We are included in that, okay? Don't be under, neutrality means nothing to Soviet Russia. Neutrality means nothing to the modern Russia. They look at what we say and what we do and what infrastructure we host, etc., and they put us all in the same group. Okay? So just don't think that we're that Vladimir or another actor like him, one of these extreme regimes, looks and says, Ireland's okay, we're not okay. I was just looking at one of the questions here coming up in the panel about how neutrality affected us internationally post-World War II. I mean, there's nobody in the room, I'm sure, that can remember this, but the Soviet Russia, Stalin, objected to us getting into the UN. Okay, on the basis, this is a nation that's lost 20 million in that war, 26 million. What did you do? What did you do? You're not getting into this international club, whatever else, and the veto is used. And so we see ourselves a certain way. We take a stance to a certain extent. We grade our own homework. Okay, we look at it and say, yeah, we've done this, that's good, that fits in for us. But flick the mirror on the other side, how is that going to be perceived by other people? Yeah, that's all I want to say about that.
Dermot Pivoy asks on the Slido, referencing an earlier panel from yesterday, where one of the panelists said neutrality is not a religion. And he asked, should we now be treating it as a practical option for our own defence rather than some sort of religion? I'd like to add to that, though, and ask, maybe, when did we start thinking of neutrality as a religion, as a sacred cow? If we were having this debate in the 60s, would feelings be as high? Would people be protesting outside? or did it come solidified at a later stage? And anyone who wants to come in on that.
I think from the late 60s, yes, and that's when public opinion starts getting interested in foreign policy. And, you know, Frank Aiken, we hold up as one of our great foreign ministers, but he was also in favour of a secretive form of foreign policy. I believe he gave some of his estimate speech in Irish so that individuals looking in didn't understand what he was saying, which says something else about our knowledge of Anshanga Nashunta. But anyway, the sense... I've lost my train of thought there. Now, can you remind me on I was thinking about Frank Aiken. Oh, yes, on protests. Protests. That really from the late 60s, public opinion gets interested in foreign policy. It's not so interested prior to that. I see the Spanish Civil War is mentioned there, the response to Ethiopia and Abyssinia, that's mentioned too. But really, I think this debate that becomes possibly fossilized in the 1980s about neutrality starts in the 1960s in protest movements, because Ireland becomes aware of the world in a way that it wasn't through the 50s and earlier. And that's due to TV, due to media, due to a greater outward expansion of the Irish mindset.
Is that a reaction to like the Vietnam War and the
I think so.
movement?
Yeah, I think it all links into that, and it's all part of a broadening perspective of the people of Ireland.
There's an interesting question, Kiva, you might like to come in on that. What role, if any, did the Catholic Church play on influencing Irish neutrality? And that's from Boris Glacken of the Tyndall National Institute. I know they were heavily involved in the anti-conscription movement. Were they involved in kind of any... is there any evidence of them having a view on neutrality throughout the rest of the history of the state?
Well, the Catholic... mentioning the Spanish Civil War, this great moment of international crisis in the 1930s. De Valera's government has recognised the Republican government, and when the Civil War breaks out in Spain, the Catholic Church, as we know, are one of many influential voices within Irish society who are in favour of the Francoist regime. Many people here will be familiar with the different brigades that were raised from Ireland to go off. And of course, Ona Duffy's brigade was far more numerous, less militarily successful, but far more numerous than the Irish members of the International Brigade. And the Spanish Civil War is an interesting moment also, because that's when, although De Valera has recognised the Republican government and, logically might be expected to support them, the Irish government is in favour and supports the Committee on Non-Intervention, the Non-Intervention Committee, which prevents material, supplies, personnel from going to Spain. And of course, there were consequences to that. The consequences of that decision on the part of the international community was the victory of fascism in Spain and everything that happened in Spain for the entirety of the Francoist regime. So those are questions, those are issues that we have to look squarely in the face and recognise. So I think, if anything, the Catholic Church in the case of the Spanish Civil War is in favour of intervention on the Francoist side, not on the Republican side.
But in the post-war period, and many of you out there will remember, pray for the conversion of Russia. Yes. The Catholic Church weighs in on the side of anti-communism, and Ireland is a strongly anti-communist state.
I've got 2 minutes left. I see one question at the back. Do you want to give me I'm just going to go to this gentleman at the back.
Thanks very much, Edward Burke. I just had, since we have Michael here, who's written so much on the Congo, I think, and since we're talking about the Catholic Church, I mean, obviously the Catholic Church in 1960 was very sort of pro-Belgian when it came to the Congo intervention. And Ireland, as you and I, Michael, spent time sifting through the files where Irish diplomats were talking about the need to get rid of the Prime Minister of the Congo, Patrice Lumumba, who was called many derogatory things. And so Ireland allied itself very much with Britain, the United States, and other Western countries to try and ensure that he was removed. And that's why white-only troops were sent to Katanga, the secessionist province, in August 1960. So obviously the Congo is sort of very much up there in sort of the pantheon of our impartiality in terms of our United Nations contribution. But I just wonder if you'd say something about the slightly more real and problematic history of that initial intervention. Obviously, once Lumumba goes, then the secession of Katanga can end. But there is a determination, including by Irish diplomats at the UN, to get rid of him.
Well, Chair, very quickly. May I? I think Irish records shine a very important light on Congo and on the fighting that broke out in Elizabethville. Conor Cruz O'Brien was involved in being scapegoated by the UN for. We have a document by Fred Boland, our ambassador to the UN, our perm rep from that time, who shows very clearly how UN Sec-Gen Dag Hammarskjöld gave the go-ahead for the abortive UN mission to try and end the secession of Katanga. And going through the files in the National Archives, in UN archives in New York, wherever, we get that insights into history that the general narrative might sometimes blot out. And here, in a small state archive, we get an insight, a new spotlight on a very important and dark part of the UN's history in that report from Fred Boland. So maybe that gives you something, Ed, of what's in the Department of Foreign Affairs archive for the period, which is a fantastic source for the Congo operation, as is military archives in Colabrew Barracks too.
On that note, we'll wrap things up. I just want to say thank you very much to the wonderful panel, Michael Kennedy, David Murphy and Kiva Nick David. Thank you so much for your time and insights. Our next panel and final panel, chaired by the boss, Louise Richardson, Roger Cole, Bridget Laffin and Dan O'Brien, are going to discuss neutrality as it is now, its definitions, options and implications. So stick around.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you can hear me, we're not actually taking a break. We're going to move straight into the next session. But if you can give us just about 5 minutes to set things up, feel free to move around the room. Testing 1, 2. So do I have everybody? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're about to start the final session, so if we could have everybody into the room and if you could please take your seats. Huh? You don't need it on stage, do you?
I'll turn it off.
Okay, as they would say in the theatre, this is our final call for everybody to please resume their seats. I've been told that I'm not talking loud enough, so could you just get everybody in and we can start the next session, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming back after the break, or without a break, I should say. I'm delighted to be joined by three panellists who are going to explore the question of neutrality with us. On my left is Roger Cole, who is founder and chairman of the Peace and Neutrality Alliance, PANA. Next to him is Bridget Lavin, emeritus professor at the European University Institute. And finally, Dan O'Brien. Dan is chief economist at the Irish Institute of International and European Affairs. So this, as you know, is the final session of the 4 days, and it is on the subject of neutrality, following from the historical perspective we've just had. And we're going to focus on definitions, options, and implications. And I thought I would cut to the chase immediately by asking each of the panel whether or not they think our current policy of military neutrality is fit for purpose in the current global security environment. Roger, what do you think?
I prefer the word neutrality. I've always got slightly confused with this word military neutrality that I had never heard of until, relatively speaking, recently. What happens is that we need to have, as we do have, that is the Peace Neutrality Alliance, from public opinion polls, the support of the vast majority of the Irish people that say they support Irish neutrality in referendum after referendum after, and they don't, and that's a very clear commitment that's possibly going even stronger rather than weaker. Now, we don't know, and things can go up and down, but I think it's a strong commitment to Irish neutrality, and it's quite widespread and popular.
Thank you. Bridget.
So I'm always, as an old hand at teaching, I'm always on the lookout for the teaching moments at forums like this. And we had one such teaching moment yesterday with Laurent Gauchel, the professor from Swiss Peace, when he said neutrality is not a religion, it's a foreign and security policy concept. And that is something we should all remember. It is not a religion, it is a concept that has to do with foreign policy, defence and security. So when you ask the question, is our military neutrality, which is the phrase that's used in official documents and what was put into the protocol following the Lisbon Treaty, the phrase is military neutrality. Is it fit for purpose? So the test then has to be, is it fit for purpose in terms of the security and defence of this country? And we heard again today that security is not just state security, it's also human security and ecological security. So I think we have to answer all of that when it comes to fit for purpose. So firstly, in terms of the security of the state security, the practice, there's a distinction between something that is a concept and how it's practiced. And the practice of neutrality in this jurisdiction is such that we do not and have not invested properly either in a security strategy, a security policy, security capability, and we don't have a singular centre of security within the state in terms of a national security advisor. So I think there is a whole body of work, and it's happening. We heard that this morning on one of the panels, the capability development. So I think that's an area that we really need to pay attention to. The second area, and I won't say much about it now, but I hope to get an opportunity later, is the question at the last is who is the we? Ireland is an EU member state. We're not an isolated island. As an EU member state, we have treaty commitments, we have partners, we have neighbours. And so when we talk about our military neutrality, we also have to be cognizant of our responsibility as a member state and as a neighbour and as a partner. And in this regard, I would ask all of us as Irish people to think very carefully about the solidarity that was shown our country by 26 countries during Brexit. And it's not that there's a ledger in every foreign ministry and every chancellery throughout Europe that says Brexit, 100% support for Ireland, payment. That's not how this works. But it's our honour and our responsibility as a people to take seriously the solidarity we were shown and to ask ourselves what the demands are of us as a good neighbour and a good partner. So not in terms of great power politics or anything like that, but just our responsibility as a good neighbour.
Thank you, Bridget. And Dan, what do you think?
Okay, so there's been a lot of talk about how unique Ireland is in many ways. I don't think any country is uniquely unique, but I think we are different in the sense that we don't, of any country I know, we speak in our political discourse less about security and defence than any country I know. And that's been the case for decades. It's very unusual. And I think it's great that we're having this sort of discussion and there's been so much exposure to the issue. Like many people in Ireland, like most people according to opinion polls, the EU is is a pillar of both our foreign policy and of European peace and prosperity. I'm of the view that there are two pillars that have brought about peace, prosperity and stability in Europe over the past 70 years. One is the EU and the other is NATO. I am an unabashed supporter of NATO. I think we should have been founding members. I think maybe prior to this discussion here, that the inter-party government came into government just as NATO was being formed. And I wonder if there had been a government in office for a longer period of time, if there had been a different foreign minister, perhaps the gambit of trying to get the Americans to push the British on partition would not have been attempted, and we would have ended up in NATO and everything would have been very different. And let me just sort of say how normal that is. I've spent most of my life living in other European countries, and the sheer normality across the political spectrum in most European countries, boringly repeated again and again. The EU and NATO are the twin pillars of our foreign policy. It's said everywhere, and just as recently as last January, I did a podcast, everyone's doing a podcast these days, with a Scottish Nationalist Party member of Parliament, member of the Westminster Parliament, asked him, what would an independent Scottish foreign policy look like? The twin pillars of the EU and NATO. And just how standard that is. And just a final point, that in our North Atlantic home, if we look around us, go up to Iceland, across to Norway, all the countries facing out across the Atlantic to North America, the US and Canada, every single country around us in our North Atlantic home have been long-standing members of NATO. Are they all wrong and we're right?
Thank you. Well, one of the things that's been absolutely clear over the last few days is that neutrality means different things to different people. We had representatives of 4 neutral countries here yesterday, and in the case of Finland, for example, they could field a 1 million-person army in the case of invasion. These other countries have very different defence postures than we have, even though they're neutral. So how would you like our neutrality to be defined, Roger? If you could define Irish neutrality as you would like it to be, how would it look?
Let me just answer one other question that has risen. This issue that somehow or other people who advocate neutrality or suggest it it's a religion. Now, let me say this. I've been campaigning for Irish neutrality for most of my life in the Irish campaign for nuclear disarmament, and then much later in the Irish Peace and Neutrality Alliance. And I have never, ever heard it being compared to a religion. So I thought it was a fatuous, silly remark that has no bearing in how Irish people think. It just isn't true. Irish neutrality came about a long time ago by Wolfe Tone when he wrote his pamphlet, The Spanish War, and said we wanted a united, independent, democratic and neutral state. And he wrote that in 1790. And it was republished by Cumann na Món in 1915. When Redmond said we should all go and die for the British Empire, all the leaders, all the people who later became the leaders of the 1916 Rising, became and founded the Irish Neutrality League. So all those that were executed by the British Empire were all also members of the Irish Neutrality League. My father was an active member of the Fianna Fáil party. And one thing I still remember was his introduction to Frank Aiken to me. Being Irish, being neutral are one and the same thing for an awful lot of people. And we are not interested, and I think this is reflected by the current government and by the opposition. They do not want to join NATO. It's a nuclear-armed military alliance. And the greatest Minister for Foreign Affairs we ever had was Frank Aiken, who pursued a policy of seeking to end the existence of nuclear weapons. That's what neutrality means. It means active participation in the United Nations. Because one of the other things that comes across very clearly here, Europe constitutes 9% of the population. The United States constitutes 4%. Do your maths. There's a changing world. The third world, what used to be called the third world, are now becoming really big and powerful. And they're tired of this lecturing to by people, many, many countries in Europe, whether it's France, whether it's Portugal, whether it's Spain, whether it's Poland, whether it was Holland, Denmark. There's a whole tradition of imperial conquest of other people's countries. And we have a sense of sympathy with people in those countries because our country was invaded and conquered, first by the English in 1169 and later by the British Empire. So, I mean, that's what being neutral is. It just means we are not Belgians, and we are not Finnish, and we are not Austrian. We're Irish. We have our own history. And that history is absolutely linked up with being a neutral state.
Thank you, Roger. Can I just, and we did, of course, have an excellent panel on the historical evolution of Irish neutrality, but can I just follow up on this point, this involvement with the UN and commitment to the Global South, and yet the Global South, as you know, is precluded from participation in the Security Council. So what do we do about that?
Well, we should be advocating that countries like India should be members of the Security Council. It's a massive country, and they're getting tired of not being regarded as a major country. And Aiken played a key role in advocating that China become part of the Security Council. Brazil is another major country, and they're wondering why they're not. This is one of the problems. When people talk about Irish neutrality in certain circles, it's kind of completely linked up with other European countries. But there is a world out there. You know, there's more to the world than simply Europe. 9% of the population of the world. And we're not thinking correctly about how if you're talking, I mean, the minister there talked about the global problems of the crisis of the global weather change, alterations rapidly, so fast that if it's going to be solved, it has to be solved on a global basis. The idea that it'll all be solved by little Ireland or little Europe is not an option. We have to be thinking differently when we're talking about our foreign policy and our attitude towards the real problems that faces every single human being on this planet.
Thank you. So your position then is that our current position of neutrality is the optimum policy?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Bridget, how would you ideally like to define our neutrality?
So I firstly don't speak I don't speak for anyone else but myself. And what I think I would like to say about our policy of neutrality, I don't think there is sufficient public support for Ireland to engage in any mutual defence commitment. And I think it's the sort of thing that would require high levels of consensus. And we, in the discussion yesterday, both of Finland, less in terms of Sweden, but there was certainly a sense in Finland that it was the considered will of the people to join. It was the considered will of the people to join NATO. But I think we can't get away from geography. We are a European state. We're a member state of the EU, and the EU is our geopolitical, geoeconomic anchor. And we can try to think ourselves beyond that and away from that. That doesn't mean we should be Europe-centric, but it means we should start from first principles. So in terms of securing and responding to the threats that this state faces, we have to cooperate with others. And in my view, there are three options. One is the cooperation that we are doing and will continue to do as a member state of the EU through PESCO, the European Defence Agency, and all of that. Now, the EU will become a more serious security player over the next decade than it is now. Why? Because there is a vicious war in Europe, a genocidal war against a people with the number of war crimes running into the thousands now. And we should, at least after the weekend, know that we're dealing potentially with an extraordinarily unstable Russia, which should really frighten all of us because of their nuclear arsenal. So the EU is one important context for our security cooperation. We're already doing it in PESCO. We should do more of it. The second is our partnership for peace with NATO. NATO, most European countries are members of NATO, and I agree with Dan on that for many countries in Europe, NATO is the second pillar of their security. And I will always remember after 89, it was 1991, walking past in Warsaw, past the presidential palace and seeing the NATO flag. And for Poland, the NATO flag offered security, and anyone who knows anything about Polish history would know the importance of that flag. Our history is different and we don't need it. But I again ask the question I asked yesterday. NATO is establishing a centre for the surveillance of the seabed. In the UK, will this country engage with that, be a member of it, participate with it, have an MOU on it, etc., etc.? I see the French ambassador here. We're building an electricity interconnector to France. That is a critical infrastructure for this country. Who will secure it? Who will defend it? Who will ensure that we don't end up with incidents? So I think that's another part. And then there probably is a third way, and that is in terms of multiple bilateralism with maybe the Atlantic arc states, down France, Spain, Portugal. In other words, the Atlantic dimension, because we are a maritime nation. Our economic waters are 12 times the size of the country, and yet our naval capacity is non-existent. And so the fourth element has to be that we pay due attention to the needs of our armed forces. And again, listening to the Swedes and the Finns yesterday, they take this very seriously because they had no choice. They're holistic, they're comprehensive, and we're building towards that, but we're way away from it. So I would say they're the four components within Ireland in terms of our own security forces, the EU, partnership for peace, and then multiple bilateralism, however you call it. And I think if we're serious about the security of our country and the threats we face, then we can't do it on our own. We're not going to spend the gross product that would be required to have armed neutrality. But we can't ignore the fact that geography no longer protects us.
Thank you very much. So, Dan, you have a different perspective.
Well, can I also suggest...
Sorry, Dan, if you don't mind, just because the way you're placed, it's hard for them to hear you at the back if you spoke into the mic.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. So, like Bridget, I only speak for myself. I don't speak... My institute doesn't have a corporate position, so I'm only speaking for myself. Maybe 3 points. Again, on the NATO issue, there was an interesting opinion poll of the weekend which showed just over a third of people oppose joining NATO, a third of people were in favour, and just under a third were either way. So I wonder if there was a citizens' assembly on it and people were exposed to it. I actually wouldn't be at all surprised if we took the standard European view on it and ended up public opinion shifting, because I honestly think most people don't really give that much thought to it, and the view that NATO is some sort of evil empire out there is not one. It's held by a minority of people, in my estimation, and most people ultimately an American-led entity like the like NATO, the US fundamentally, as the Joe Biden visit showed, we are fundamentally a pro-EU country, a pro-United States country. So it would be interesting if we really had a national debate how opinion could change. Third, the world is definitely becoming a more... We're going back into a Cold War situation. The change with China, I've been going to China for 20 years, I haven't gone for quite a while, but the change over the last 5 or 6 years has just been astonishing, and the way the European political class has changed its view of China from it being an opportunity to it being a strategic rival to it being an outright threat is palpable, and it's happened very, very quickly. And I think that's something that we with so much going on in this current decade, maybe we haven't given enough attention to it. And the invasion of Taiwan would be an event much bigger, in my view, than the invasion of Ukraine from a geopolitical perspective. Somebody said yesterday, Russia is the storm, China is climate change. I thought it kind of put it nicely. And just finally, on Roger's point about engaging with non-European countries, I just don't see it as an either-or. Yep. I think you can be both thoroughly pro-Europe, a member of the EU, a member of NATO, a member of the WTO, a member of the UN, a member of all of these. It's not an international organization I wouldn't like us to be a member of. You can do all those things and engage in the way that you, in an individual country, want to engage with non-Western countries. So I just don't see it as an either-or.
Thank you. So there is consensus across the piece that we should be heavily engaged in Europe. That has been the theme throughout the past few days. Roger, I think, would like to cap it at our current level of cooperation. Is that right, Roger?
I think the European Union has been very good for Ireland. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's a single solitary person who wouldn't agree with that. It's our access to a very large market. That's one of the core reasons why other multinationals that want to reach that market operates in Ireland. And in fact, one of the reasons is, that's because the tax. In fact, the tax was increased, and there wasn't a problem. In other words, they're not necessarily against paying more tax. I'm sure the governments are well aware they'll have a few more bob to spend than they thought they might have a few years ago.
Well,
so it's nothing to do with being anti-European. PANA has a very large network of people who are working for similar views that we have throughout Europe and indeed throughout America, and indeed in other countries as well. I mean, it's got nothing to do with being anti-European, but we're not in favour of a European Union with an European army. And we don't want to go down that road, because the real issue facing everybody in the world is global warming, as was said by Eamon Ryan earlier on. We have to start thinking differently from seeing everybody as an enemy, that was said a few minutes ago. I mean, if we're going to solve global warming, you can't keep on seeing other countries that aren't the same as you as enemies. There has to be a situation where you have to have a positive dialogue with all the other countries in the world, because that's the core issue that's facing us all. And that's the situation as I see it. And I think the interpretations of countries that have pulled millions of people out of starvation and hunger, I mean, when the Brits were going around the place flogging drugs to them and blowing them up if they didn't agree, those days have long gone. The Chinese aren't going to allow the English Empire to do it again. And I don't think they, even though they have, I mean, they've joined some military alliance in the Pacific, but I mean, which is, as far as I know, not that near England, unless things have changed somehow.
I think Bridget would like to.
So I think China is a very powerful, very successful country now. I've been again watching the European discussion around China for a very long time. And there was a time in which people, and it was also Clinton, the Americans, thought trade with China and China will change. Well, no, the Chinese have every right to develop within their state as they see fit. But what has certainly emerged is that balance between cooperation, competitor economically, because that's there, and systemic rival has altered. And I think the von der Leyen speech on the 30th of March, where she talked of de-risking the relationship with China, is close to where the consensus is going in terms of not to be over-reliant on supply chains that are not diversified, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there are also the other element of security that we haven't talked about over the last couple of days, or not a lot, and something that is certainly ratcheting up the agenda is economic security. On supply chains, on diversification, not to be over-reliant, energy, that the weaponization of interdependence as we saw with energy. So I think these are all live debates as individual countries, the EU, but also the entire globe are grappling with the answers. And we are at one of those times in history, where the tectonic plates are shifting and we're moving from one type of world order into a different world order, which rightly because of the demands of countries to be for representation in global governance and in institutions. But it's not settled. And I think for all countries, uncertainty and risk has increased. And at times of uncertainty and risk, a premium has to be placed on agility and adaptability. So again, I think we should keep very open minds about these questions because our world is shifting pretty quickly.
Well, just on this, the economics of all this, we're in an unusual situation I think Dan mentioned a moment ago just how little conversation there has been in this country about foreign and security policy. We're also an outlier in the size of our defence forces, much smaller than the other neutral countries. And we spend a great deal less of our national income on international security and defence. What do you think would be a legitimate sum for us to spend? Dan, you're the economist. I'll start with you.
Well, one of the reasons I'm in favour of joining NATO is because I actually think it would mean we could spend less than being serious about being really neutral and having to beef up our armed forces. And as an economist, and as a human being, spending money on military equipment when it could be used for much better purposes is something I have never advocated and find I can see the logic of it. I can see in a changed world where it's necessary, but it just to articulate those words, we should spend more money on armaments, is something I find very, very difficult to do.
Richard.
Again, it would be better for our world if we didn't need military forces, but I am not a pacifist to the extent that I recognise that in a world there is a right to defence and to defend yourself if attacked, and that by implication means that you must have armed forces. I certainly think I can't envisage us. I think one of the speakers this morning talked of Poland going to 5% of gross product. It's never going to happen in Ireland. I would say if we even get to 1% or 2%, I mean, I just can't see us. But I think we have to be very smart with that money, targeted, And it's not an area that I know anything about, so I won't make any. I won't make it. I have no views on KIT.
Well, I think Dan will probably know better than me, but my understanding is that 2% of GDP is what European countries are requested to. Not that they all meet.
NATO, in NATO, but the majority of NATO countries don't spend that, and have not spent that, and it's one of the reasons why there's been a long time, as long as I've been around, this niggle across the Atlantic with the Americans feeling sore that billions of their tax dollars go on providing security for us, and why should that be the case? We're one of the richest parts in the world. Why can we not take responsibility for our own security ourselves?
Thank you. Roger.
Well, I know everybody here is here because they're interested in security policy, but I'm sure there's no politician here who doesn't know that most people spend their time worrying about the housing crisis. They're worried about the health system. They're concerned about other issues. So, I mean, if you're going to have a certain amount of money coming in, a certain amount of money has to be allocated to defence from actual, real, possible options rather than creating some mythological situation. And I think that if the government starts spending a lot of money on a huge army, would be, I think there might be problems from people who are concerned about the health system, about the other issues that concern most people most of the time. So you have to be very careful about what you're spending money on in terms of the actual possibility. I mean, the fact is, as I said at the very beginning, the only people in our entire history that's actually ever invaded, conquered, planted Ireland has been the English and later on the British Empire. And I don't think there is a shred of evidence that they're going to do it again. I mean, I really think that's just not a runner. And in fact, the problem you could say with Britain is their biggest growth rate is food banks. They're not in great shape economically, so that's another reason why they're not going to be getting out of us. And it was a great victory, and I must compliment our Taoiseach, or Tánaiste. I get confused about what you are now. In terms of the achievements of staying within the European Union, and hopefully at some stage the same thing will happen, and they'll say, "Look, oops, we made a mistake," and they might even come back because everybody makes mistakes, and they're very nice people by and large. Not necessarily the Tory government, I have to admit. But, so you can have situations, you have to decide when you're spending money on defence, what are the reasonably realistic possibilities of an invasion if the country that did it most of the time isn't going to do it again?
Bridget,
so I absolutely agree with Roger. The United Kingdom will not invade Ireland. But that doesn't mean that we're threat-free. So what we have to focus on is who's defending and how are we defending our critical infrastructure, how can we defend ourselves against cyber attack, and do we know what's happening in the skies above us and in the seas that surround us, and what's our responsibility to that, to the cables, to the interconnector, etc., etc. So real threats, they're not imaginary. So I absolutely agree with you. The United Kingdom will not re-invade Ireland. It's a done deal.
Thank you. Well, actually, earlier this morning we heard about a threat-based national security strategy.
Which is essential.
Yeah. A question has come in from the floor which anticipated my next question, so I'm going to ask it. It was posed by Donald Denman, and he said, "I'm surprised by the lack of reference in this forum to the border, wherever it is, to the status of Northern Ireland as part of NATO, and to how we reconcile this, both with our neutrality and with our aspirations for all Ireland unity." So again, Eva in the last panel mentioned this nexus. It's come up a couple of times in the course of the past couple of days. But clearly, a new Ireland, it would pose a challenge to the concept of neutrality. Presumably either we would all have to leave NATO or all join NATO, given that part of the country, Northern Ireland, is currently in NATO. What do you think?
Well, I suspect somebody said to me that an awful lot of people in the unionist tradition in the north have very close contacts, disproportionately high levels of contacts with the military, and have served in the British military. It's my understanding. Somebody said that to me once. So if that's true, I have no reason to doubt it. Then I suspect Northern Unionists would feel as bad about being deprived of their NATO membership as Northern Nationalists felt about being deprived of their EU membership.
Roger?
Well, I'm an Irish Republican. I said that earlier on. My father was. He's a strong supporter of the Soldiers of Destiny. And that's where I got it from. And I want to see a united Ireland. I wanted to see a united Ireland as soon as possible, as soon as we can negotiate a settlement. And I want to make certain that united Ireland is in the vision of Wolfe Tone, i.e. all of it, a neutral country. And maybe not everybody agrees with that, but that would be my personal objective.
So I think it's a wonderful question, and what it highlights, not just about Irish foreign policy, but rather what kind of state that new Ireland would have. And I think it would have to be negotiated. I don't think it can be a takeover by the 26 counties of the 6, because that kind of Ireland won't work. So I think it's one of the issues, to add to many more, about what kind of Ireland we would have as an all-island state.
Okay. I'm going to take a few more questions from Slido, and then I see there's a bunch from the floor. One here on, before we get off definitions completely, from Avril Nikablik, which is, I'm pretty sure that I only started hearing a distinction between political and military neutrality from the media after the invasion of Ukraine. Before that, we were just neutral. Any comment?
No, absolutely not. It goes way back in official documents in Ireland. And in fact, it's Article 3 or 3, I think, of the protocol appended to the Lisbon Treaty. So it's not after the invasion of Ukraine.
Okay. Do you want to say? Yeah.
No, I'm happy, as I said, I'm happy, much happier as an Irishman with the word Irish neutrality.
Okay, my goodness, we have a lot of questions on the floor. I'm going to privilege those I haven't seen speak before. This gentleman in the blue jacket right here in the third row. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is John Marr. Just drawing on a point that Bridget raised earlier on with regard to the EU becoming closer over the coming years with regard to defence cooperation arrangements. Excuse me. Could you envisage a period in a few years' time where Ireland will have to decide between its neutrality and full participation within the European Union if the European Union were to go down closer engagement of defence, such as a closer cooperation that would impinge on what we view as Irish neutrality today? So really the question is neutrality or full partition or participation in the European Union.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the deputy in the front row.
Garamaigad Cahirlock, Matt Carty. I'm the Sinn Féin spokesperson on Foreign Affairs and Defence. And can I just say, I found all of the speakers across all 4 days incredibly interesting. I do, and I'm on record as saying I do think that there could have been more balance, particularly on sessions such as this. And I do regret that there was no formal role for the opposition at all. And just to put that on the record, again, notwithstanding that, the conversation has been brought to another level, and I think that's crucially important. And that point about the opposition and government and having a broad-based conversation is crucially important, because I think what we've learned from the historical debates earlier on, but also over the past 4 days, is that decisions made by one government can have profound implications for governments to come and for generations to come. And that's why it's crucially important that we get these things right, particularly in respect of the current trajectory that is clearly being enunciated by government representatives in respect of the triple lock. And the question that hasn't been answered, in my view, is what mission up until this point do those who want to see us abandon the triple lock, what mission were they prevented or precluded by that lock from participating up until this point? The only one that has been referenced is a 1999 decision in respect of Macedonia, which was before we actually adopted the triple lock itself. And secondly, what are the implications for us getting this wrong at any particular point in time? In other words, becoming involved in a mission that doesn't have a UN mandate, and for it to go wrong. And these things do go wrong, and not everybody has the benign or positive attitude towards NATO that Dan has, for example. And there have been instances where countries' reputations have been damaged for quite an amount of time because of their military intervention that went wrong. So I think that's crucially important. But finally, the other aspect of our foreign policy that has, that deserves, in my view, a little bit more consideration is that of us having an independent foreign policy within the EU. And I've referenced previously the correct rhetoric and actions that we have taken in response to the Russian illegal invasion of Ukraine should be matched by equal rhetoric and actions in respect of what has been the most consistent breach of UN resolutions over decades now, which is the actions of the Israeli state in respect of Palestine. And on many occasions we're told that Ireland can't take actions because we want to do it in concert with other EU states. And in my view, we should be able to, as we were in respect of apartheid South Africa, do the same in respect of Israeli apartheid today. But finally, the point that has been referenced in terms of the EU. Here's the truth of the matter. We have a very weak defence forces. We have very brave and honourable members of the defence forces that have been badly served because of underinvestment. And there is, at this point, I think, a large consensus that we need to increase investment, provide our defence forces with the pay and conditions that they deserve, and give them the equipment that they need in order to monitor our skies and seas and protect us against modern threats. But then, following from that is, what is our best contribution to the EU? Is it as another military power aligned with the EU, or is it as a neutral state that can actually play a positive role in resolving conflict and bringing conflict to an end? In my view, Ireland is best placed because of our history, because of our current position, and because of the historical role of our defence forces. We are best placed in the latter scenario, and that's where I think the trajectory of our foreign policy and defence policy should move to.
Thank you very much, Deputy. I'll take one more, and that's the gentleman in the middle in the back with the dark hair.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yes. Owen McNamara. I'm a research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki. And it's very interesting. It's hard to get a question in sometimes. It's great to see the interest in security policy issues. Interesting comments also at the start, the great praise and the rightful praise for Frank Aiken and the great contribution that he made to the non-proliferation treaty, the treaty on non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. And then, of course, the schizophrenic contradictory comment about India, which is currently outside the NPT framework and it essentially worked against it when it became a nuclear power. So we need to also remember that when we think of rules-based international order. But be that as it may, I hear a lot of commentary about Finland and a lot of correspondence between Finland and Ireland. I was even in at the Oireachtas Joint Committee on European Union Affairs, speaking on this back in Dublin here last week. And I often think, working in the Finnish environment, the Finnish policy shop, that is the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, what do they have in Finland in security policy that we don't have in Ireland? They have a lot that we don't have here in Ireland. But two things I think we could really work on. Maybe this is a kind of a teaching question that Bridget, or a teaching comment that Bridget Laffin mentioned. In Finland, lots of people, there's a very developed debate, so they know about the strategic environment as it turns. You can talk to the Finn on the street, the Finnish taxi driver, a mother in a cafe, someone on the bus, and they will know how the world is turning, and this will then inform the political debate. But the Nordic countries in general, and Finland in particular, they have consensus. They've had ding-dong debates over NATO going back 10, 15 years into the 1990s. As soon as they joined the European Union, they've had ding-dong debates. That debate has reversed quickly thanks to Putin's actions in Ukraine. But they have these ding-dong debates. They're very, very divisive. They can be very, very impassioned. But they always come back to consensus. Consensus that builds unity. Consensus behind a security policy that works, no matter which option they choose. I'm very glad to see this debate now taking place in Ireland. Can be a bit divisive at times, can be a bit bitter. We've all been following the music, or not the music.
Sir, could you frame the question, please?
The media commentary, but I really, really hope that we can build the political responsibility to have more consensus. So what I would be very interested to know what the panel might think on the prospects for this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Panel, we have three very different questions. Who'd like to begin?
The deputy's question about Ireland's role as a peacemaker. Again, I just don't see it as just Ireland's role as a peacemaker. I just don't see it as an either-or. So you raised the specific case of Israel-Palestine. Amongst the EU27, Ireland would be viewed as the most pro-Palestinian of the member states. Being a member of the EU hasn't, to my knowledge, constrained us from pursuing that view. And if we were in NATO, obviously we weren't in NATO, we're not in NATO, but the US might be considered to take a view at the other end of the spectrum. Never to my knowledge has the US lent on Ireland to take a different view on Israel-Palestine. So my point is that within friendly democracies, they don't lean on each other too much when one wants to take a different view and when another country doesn't. So I think we can have an independent position on various things, regardless of which organizations we're members of.
Thank you. Bridget.
So can I start with the first question on, could I envisage circumstances in which Ireland would have to choose between EU membership and neutrality? So the thing to remember about the EU is that it's rigid in terms of its treaties, but it's actually very permissive in terms of opt-outs and opt-ins once you're a member state. And the jargon phrase for that is differentiated integration. So it's a highly differentiated system. And PESCO and the EDA are very intergovernmental, and countries engage with them in terms of what they want to do. I think the only big game changer in Europe in terms of security and defence would be a withdrawal of the US security umbrella in Europe, in which case, if that ever happened, I think we live in a very different and new world, and I frankly would make no predictions. I think it could be a federalising event of an extraordinary kind. Would it happen? What's the probability of it happening? I don't know. But so I think the present EU allows Ireland a lot of latitude. But then the question for Ireland is, what parts of this do we want to be involved in our own interests and in the interests of the threats that we face? And that brings me on to Deputy Carty. And I don't think that EU membership deprives us of an independent strain in our foreign policy. All countries pursue their top issues. But what EU membership does carry is that there is an obligation to cooperation, and you are a member state. And you can't be a member state and pretend you're a non-member state. So with EU membership comes obligations, and that whole thing about, being a neighbour and being a neighbour and being a partner. And on Palestine, again, I can't see EU membership preventing an Irish government in terms of its choices about Palestine. You may object to the existing government's choices about Palestine, but I don't see EU membership as a constraint as such, other than that there is an attempt at common positions. And then on the Finns, I think just Finland is a different universe when it comes to defence and security, and it has to be because of that very long border with Russia and the history of Finland itself. But I am always very struck when I go to Helsinki, and I've spoken at your institute several times, at the quality of the debate. there is what one might call an attentive, knowledgeable public.
Thank you. Roger.
I've been always a strong supporter of of the Palestinians, largely because it's the same thing. They were invaded, conquered, occupied, colonized, and now, as we now know, frequently they just shoot Palestinians, the Israelis, anytime they like. And there's no question that Irish people, by and large, don't identify with that particular activity by the Zionists. They won't agree, which they should agree, is a two-nation state. This is what a solution is and could be. And I can't believe that the vast majority of the Irish people who are interested in this particular issue don't agree that there should be more activity by the Irish government reflecting the views of the Irish people who are concerned about that particular issue. Secondly, the question of, we'll come back to it, of Britain. I mean, I've been to England a lot of times. They're tremendous people. Just, as I said, not the Tory government, but, by and large, there is no reason why we have to negotiate, and that's been done by a lot of people who've been in the business for a long time, about what kind of united Ireland is going to be and when it's going to happen, because nobody actually knows that. But, I mean, it seems to me there's evidence we have to start talking about it more actively and engage in what kind of united Ireland we want, because that's part of what we have to do, and the sooner the better. In the question of, what was the other one? The triple lock. Well, I mean, nobody's going to die of shock to know that the PANA is a great supporter of the triple lock. That was no surprise there. If anybody wants to know, we've just produced a document. I have a handful in my bag. You can have them, or you can go onto our website and you can download it. Because don't forget the historical origins of the triple lock. There was a referendum. The people who were advocating the referendum were defeated. In response to that defeat by the Irish people, what they did was they decided that the issue of neutrality was absolutely key as to why they were defeated. And then they decided we would bring in the triple lock, which was great. It meant a huge recognition of what the Irish people wanted. And then when the second Nice Treaty was passed, it's like that. It was a doddle, there's no problem. It seems to me that proves that Irish people supported the triple lock. And I don't think they've changed one little bit. I don't, the idea that this other referendum or public opinion poll was that. I think all the evidence is Irish people support Irish neutrality, and that hasn't changed a bit since Dev's Day, right?
Can I just say, there was a question on the last panel about how important neutrality was in the Lisbon referendum, and we actually have very good data on this. Richard Sinnott, my departed and wonderful colleague, did really serious work on Irish public opinion on those two referendums. And 8% of those who voted no because of neutrality. Lisbon 1. Lisbon 2, 4% voted no because of Lisbon. The biggest single reason why people voted no to the first Lisbon referendum was, and I have it, it was actually 42% voted no to the first Lisbon referendum on the right slogan, which was, if you don't know, vote no, because people didn't feel they knew enough. And one of the reasons why the Irish electorate actually doesn't react badly to engaging in second referendums is that the majority of the Irish electorate are willing to look at things again. And it was 42% not knowing enough, not having enough command or sense of comfort with what they were voting for, and 8% on the question of neutrality. So I think we need to be careful of the claims we make. And this is really serious research, in fact commissioned at the time by the Minister for Foreign Affairs. And I remember writing a paper, and I said it was the one time when I saw academic research being put to the purpose of Irish foreign policy.
Thank you, Bridget. If I could just respond to the Deputy's question, only because it has come up twice previously in the course of the past couple of days, and two different people gave identical answers to it, both from the UN perspective. They said that while there weren't cases in which the veto was used to prevent particular deployments, very often a veto isn't used. A veto is actually very rarely used, but it's the threat of the veto that prevents the issue ever coming to the Security Council. The transcripts of the discussions of the past couple of days will provide the details of both of those. Anyway, we have, I'm actually going to, some of these questions have lots of support, so I'm going to go to Slido. 15 people would like us to consider Stephen Kieran's question, which is, how can any person or country that values democracy stay neutral in light of the brutal invasion of Ukraine by Putin? Are those who refuse to consider mutual defence living outside the real world? Rose Fleming would like us to address this question. 3 NATO members and 2 authoritarian regimes have a say in Irish troop deployment. Is it not the case that the only body that should be in control of the DF should be the Oireachtas? A 2/3 Dáil vote with presidential assent, perhaps. And the third question is from Pádraig Mannion. Regarding EU solidarity with Ireland, does anyone seriously believe that Germany, France, etc., put Ireland's interests ahead of their own during the Brexit negotiations? Well, that last one was in direct response to something you said, Bridget.
So can I say that I am very confident with what I say about Brexit. I have studied it. And the idea that somehow or other we weren't shown solidarity by the other countries, and for someone to question whether Germany and France did not wholeheartedly support us in very tough, very rough negotiations, I think that is a very ungenerous, can I say, and factually incorrect. It is wrong. We were supported. And remember, Theresa May went to Donald Tusk, President of the European Council, and she said, why is there so much support for Ireland? They're a small country. That happened. And his response to the British Prime Minister was, Ireland is a member state. And remember, we think of the Baltic states. Brexit was a non-issue for them other than their citizens in the UK. They backed us to the hilt. And there was only one slight wobble in the entire negotiations in terms of support. And I think that was out of a sense of you back a member state. Interestingly, it was also an opportunity for the EU to back a small member state. It resonated with the peace project, but the idea that Ireland did not get 100% support during the Brexit negotiations, I simply have looked at the documents. I have the data. We were given 100% support in very tough negotiations when it would have been very bad for everyone in the EU if it ended up with a no-deal Brexit.
Thank you. Roger, what about the question on a 2/3 Dáil vote with presidential assent instead of the Security Council?
Yeah, I saw some smiles in the audience there when a presidential issue was arisen. No, I prefer, you see, it all depends on what you're thinking about and how your mind works. I've tried to put forward the case that Europe is, 9% of the world's population. That's a lot, but it's still only 9%. That we have to start thinking differently. There's a fundamental change going on in global politics. The conflict between the Shia and the Sunni, through to the negotiations overviewed by China, has transformed a whole region. That if people just keep on talking about Europe, Europe, Europe all the time, I think they lose track of the fact that most people aren't European in the world. I know it's a big shock for some people. Maybe they just go on holidays in Europe and they don't know. But nevertheless, anybody involved in politics should know that 9% of the population doesn't equal 100%. And the Americans only constitute 4%. So okay, they got big armies and 800 bases all over the world. And, Now they're chatting off with the Vietnamese, and many years ago when I was a young fella, they were killing thousands and thousands of them. So, people do get over wars. But I mean, you have to stop thinking like Europe all the time. There is a transformation going on in global politics that we have to take into consideration as a small independent state. And that's why I get a little bit tired of people talking about Europe all the time. You know what I mean? It seems to me that people live in this little world while actually the world is this big.
Thank you. Bridget.
So I think that it would be... NATO neutrality is a binary we shouldn't go to and reduce our debate to these extremes. Equally, it shouldn't be Europe versus the world. It is Europe and the world. And for example, a very important area of Irish foreign policy on women, peace and security. That has global impact. It is conducted by our ODA people, our foreign affairs people, in the UN Security Council. That is global. So the Irish foreign policy does not forget the world. It is a changing world, a more complex world. The anchor is Europe because that's where we are. We're not going to be geographically relocated down to either to the Pacific or the Southern Atlantic. So we're European. But it shouldn't be Europe only. It should be Europe and. And I agree with Roger. We need to develop a sophisticated sense of the changing power balances in the world. Absolutely. But the idea that somehow or other Ireland can conduct its foreign security and defence policy without cognizance of Europe, I'm afraid there was a great phrase about geopolitics, that history is geography stretched over time. You never get away from your geography.
Thank you. And Dan, would you like to address Stephen Kieran's question?
Which one was that?
About neutrality. How can anyone be neutral after the invasion of Ukraine? He goes on to ask, are those who refuse to consider mutual defence living outside the real world?
I think my views on that question have already been expressed.
17 people wanted that and gave a thumbs up to that question. So let me go back to the audience. The gentleman way in the back in the red shirt.
Hello, my name is Fionn Dempsey. I wanted to come back to a point that Bridget made at the beginning of the panel, which was the reference to the teachable moment yesterday, where one of the panelists from Switzerland said that neutrality is not a religion, and of course that became a bit of a talking point out of yesterday's sessions. That answer was in response to a question that I asked. I found it to be a rather strange answer to my question, because I thought my question was quite a simple one and wasn't in any way implying that neutrality should be considered a religious commitment. It was a question about law, about written law, and the position of the Irish government that Ireland is a neutral state. One of the other panelists from Switzerland had stated that Switzerland's policy of military neutrality is determined by the Hague Convention 5, which I made reference to. It prohibits the transit of troops of a belligerent power across a neutral power's territory. And I thought that was an interesting point to hold up to the Irish government's position that Ireland is militarily neutral, since we have a situation of US troop transits across the Irish territory for some time, and the United States has been a belligerent in numerous conflicts. I think that's an interesting question for this panel specifically, but I think it's a key question for this event, because the approach that has been taken to this series of panels has been to resolve ambiguities, and I think Dame Richardson said that neutrality means many things to many people. So, but here we have an example where there's written law. There is it's written down. There's some consensus about at least one principle about neutrality. So I just think it would be useful to get the panel to comment on that, whether the Irish government's position that Ireland is militarily neutral can be understood to be credible in the context of Hague Convention 5. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to have to ask those of you who are asking questions to be succinct. And I'm also detecting some annoyance by the people in the front that I'm not calling on them. They don't see what I can see, which is an awful lot of hands in the back. So I'm doing my best, but there's a gentleman there with a navy sweater. Thank you.
Micheál Martin. I was Defence Policy Director up till last year in the Department of Defence here in Ireland. And just want to correct a little bit of the record. So the triple lock dates from the 1960 Amendment Act on Defence. It doesn't date and had nothing to do with any of the Lisbon treaties or the Nice Treaty. It is referenced in the declaration on the Nice Treaty. It is not referenced at all in the Lisbon Treaty. And on the Lisbon Treaty, if you actually go to the protocol addressing the concerns of the Irish people, there were contraception, abortion, taxation, defence, yes, conscription, and the concept that there was going to be a European army. And in fact, the protocol states quite specifically that the Lisbon Treaty does not provide or facilitate the establishment of a European army or any form of conscription. So Mr. Juncker may have gone around Europe after that calling for a European army, but in fact there is nothing in the treaty and it requires significant treaty change to get there. Just on the triple lock, I think people seem to separate the triple or mix up the triple lock and neutrality as if they're one and the same thing. They're two entirely separate things, and I think people need to make that differentiation. And just to reply to Deputy McCarthy, he said there was only one instance where we couldn't go because of the triple lock. That is true, but in fact we had to withdraw from Chad early because it was entering into the rainy season and there was a huge question mark over whether or not there was going to be a renewal of the mandate, and we withdrew before the rainy season so we could get our kit out. And there have been numerous warning orders certainly prepared, because I was involved in doing some of them, for contingent commanders where it went right to the wire as to whether or not the mandate was going to be renewed or not. And if the mandate wasn't renewed, our troops had to withdraw to barracks and more or less abandon anything they were doing. So there are problems with it, maybe not as problematic as some people might want it to be, but I think we do have to deal with the facts of the issue, and I think it's really important that people are aware of those things. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And there was the gentleman right behind you.
Thank you, Scott Fitzsimmons, University of Limerick. My first question is directed at Mr. Cole. First, I wanted to thank you for participating in the forum and all of your contributions today. I wanted to go back to really the first line of questioning in this session, which was the conceptual line of questioning. And I, like you, was surprised to hear neutrality described as a religion yesterday. But right after you pointed out your concern over this, you mentioned that for many people, being Irish and being neutral are one and the same. So by placing neutrality in those terms, do you feel that that is in effect making it sort of a secular religion rather than a questionable, debatable policy issue for many millions of Irish people? Connected to that, more to the panel in general, I'm wondering if you could comment on your perceptions of the origins or sources of the strong, passionate positions that various Irish people have, either for or against neutrality or some of the other issues we've been talking about over the past 4 days. Thanks.
Thank you. And I'm going to take one more question before going to the panel. The deputy in the front.
Ray Cronin, TD for North Kildare, junior spokesperson on defence for Sinn Féin. The last 4 days, listen, it's been very interesting. It's been full on, and well done to the organisers. You've certainly done a good job. There's no doubt that the room is full of people who are very interested in this subject, and there has been a general theme running through the panels that our neutrality is something kind of sanctimonious or immature or selfish, and some kind of a foolishness around that, and that as if somehow spending trillions of euros on armaments was the height of sophistication and maturity, and I just would disagree with that. Somebody drew my attention there to the last question on this for this panel discussion. And the last panel, what other security policy choices exist for Ireland and what would the implications of these be? And they felt that that was the NATO argument. And we spoke about trust earlier, and there is a belief that this forum has all been around, trying to an attack on our democracy and trying to get rid of the triple lock, and that the government has somehow been using this awful illegal war in Ukraine as an impetus to change our status on neutrality. And neutrality it's not a matter for one government, it's a matter for all the people of the state. And I think that, I think there has been a general, certainly since our president got involved, there has been a general unease around that. And, this was called a Consultative Forum. It has been quite unbalanced. I remember when I was going to school, I was taught that NATO was conceived because America was sick and tired of coming over to Europe, helping us to fight our wars, and that was the reason why NATO was conceived. But since then, there has been mission creep, I'm going to say again, a mission creep towards expanding the amount of money that we spend on armaments and what countries have to spend, how much of their GDP. And that should interest you, Dan, because you're an economist, and all that money being siphoned off to very few people is not good for the economy, because it doesn't leave money in people's pockets to spend in the natural economy. And there's also from America, we watch gun violence in America, and we say, what does it take? The argument on the people who are in favour of everybody holding several, 20, 30 guns, is that what stops a bad person with a gun is a good person with a gun. And that's kind of the creep that's been going on now, where countries are spending more money on armaments all the time, and that everybody has to join, that everybody should join NATO, that all the goodies, all of us should join NATO against everybody else. And, I would be a pacifist by nature, but as somebody pointed out to me earlier, I have a rifle in my brooch here. I'm wearing a Common Man brooch with a rifle in it. And I absolutely believe that people have a right to defend themselves. And I think that's why we feel such solidarity with the Ukrainians as well. They had a famine. They suffered from a belligerent neighbour like we did. And I think we have to talk about, investing in our defence forces, really, being able to defend our neutrality. Brigadier General Ross Mulcahy was talking earlier on about, retention, and that has to be the first thing. We have to, we can spend all the money in armaments that we want, but if we don't have the personnel to use it, it's just dead metal. So we have to be prepared to spend a certain amount of money to defend our neutrality, to defend our country. During World War II, we actually increased the size of our army exponentially during World War II, so that we were actually more of a threat to any invasion. They knew that it was going to take, that we would put up a good fight. We had a decent army. And I think around the triple lock, there can be nothing changed, there can be nothing taken away, nothing added that would make it easier for us to go to war. And I believe that very strongly, and I think we should really think very carefully about where the money would be going, about just, one man, a goodie with a gun can defeat a baddie with a gun. And it's really as basic as that. Peace and talking has to be our first primary motivation.
Thank you very much. Let's go to the panel for responses to all four questions. So choose whichever you'd like to respond to. Dan, you can begin.
Yeah, well, just on that, on the final speaking from the councillor. Sorry, do it again. That point by the councillor. From 1990, after the end of the last Cold War, there was a peace dividend. We were able to spend much less on armaments and on defence in Europe. So that was a really good thing. And when people come together at conferences like this, we always tend to look at the bad things that are happening. And now, unfortunately, there really is. The geopolitical situation is getting worse. And unfortunately, those defence budgets are going to go up. But I think it should be said that from 1990, after the end of the last Cold War, Europe was able to save a lot of money by not having to spend as much on security and defence as in previous decades. So there was positive there, so just sort of to mention that. In terms of, well, I think there was a question on why do we value neutrality. The past 4 days really does make me question whether that's actually the case, and that if we really had a more normal conversation about security and defence, that we'd have a different view.
Thank you. Bridget.
So can I just take the triple lock? So I trust an Irish government and the duly elected people in the Oireachtas, particularly in the Dáil, to be able to take decisions about the deployment of the Irish armed forces. I do not see why, as a people, we think we need a Security Council resolution that can be vetoed by any one of 5 permanent members. And I'm not naming any of them. Any one of them can veto. And so I actually thought Eamon Ryan's suggestion on, for example, the African Union was very interesting. So say, hypothetically, there's a very serious issue, as there are many in Africa, and there is a request for peacekeepers, and there can't be agreement at the Security Council on the deployment of troops. So in other words, no resolution. And the African Union comes to the EU and says, well, we would invite you to support us in maintaining peace or getting peace back. I wonder whether we think that there's something wrong with, for example, a resolution of the African Union. So in other words, I think there's a danger that we get set positions that fall into almost belief that can't be challenged. And so my plea would be, keep our minds open, because we need open minds in a world of shift and shock. We need to be adaptable. We need to be able to respond. On the question of why there's so much, on the question of, being Irish means being neutral. Well, being Irish means being neutral for some Irish people, but by no means all. And we also haven't spoken at all about the new Irish. We have many people in our country today who come from East Central Europe, who have very different historical experiences and security concerns. And when they're worried about security, they're worried about their parents back home, etc., etc. So again, we have to respect the Ireland we are now and not just the Ireland we were. So I don't believe being neutral is being committed to neutrality is a requirement to be an Irish citizen. I don't. I think people can make the connection, but it's simply a personal connection. It is and should never be a requirement. And then on the question of the Hague Convention, I simply don't know enough about international law to answer that question with any degree of knowledge, so I won't.
Roger.
Yeah, well, I certainly don't believe it either. I mean, we live in a country where people can have their opinions. There's people not in favour of neutrality, and there's people are. They're both Irish, right? That's not an issue at all. Never was with me, anyway. There was a particular question aimed, I think, at me. I live a sad life. I not only read the Spanish War book where Wolfe Tone argued in favour of Irish independence, a united Ireland and a neutral Ireland. I actually read the collected works of Tone, which is about that big and thick. It's a big book. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to everybody. But he wasn't particularly religious. He just wanted a united, independent, democratic, neutral state. And that's what he advocated. And the following year, he wrote another major, bigger book arguing in favour of equal rights between Catholic and Protestant and the centre. These are values that belong to me because I'm Irish and I'm Republican. They don't belong to other Irish people. That's fair enough. People make their choice. I got my politics, as I said, from my father, who was a hardline soldier of destiny guy. So, I mean, people have their own values. And I would obviously don't agree that, if you don't agree with neutrality, it doesn't mean you're Irish. That's twaddle. Of course you could be Irish and not agree with it. John Redmond was one of them. So, I mean, you can do it. I'm not saying you can't. And I don't understand why there should be any implication that. But the key reason why, the way I keep on saying it is, we are not a big country, but neither is the European Union massive. It's only a small percentage of the world's population. And the organisation that is inclusive of all 190 states in the world is the United Nations. And from the time of Frank Aiken and before the League of Nations, we joined the League of Nations. There's a long, long tradition of all sorts of politicians advocating and supporting the idea that we are a small country in an entire world. And because what's happening now, in particular, with the world changing so fast, as I said, with the deal done in the whole of the Middle East, which is going to transform global politics big time, that we have to be thinking globally. And of course, we have to work with our European colleagues, as we have to work with our American colleagues, and we have to work with our Chinese colleagues and many people all over the world, because we will not solve global warming, which is this one single threat that hangs over us all. Because if we don't solve that problem, we're not going to live. It won't be giving our we won't be giving our children any kind of future to look forward to. And I find that younger people I know, they are seriously worried about that because they know it won't be us. But they have a future to look forward to. They want to have a future to look forward to. So we have to work together all over the world. And I believe that that's the core value that we should advocate.
Thank you. Well, we are pretty much out of time, so I'm afraid I'm not going to. I see the hands, and I'm sorry, we're not going to get to them. Those of you who didn't get a chance, please respond to the consultation online. I'll give the panel a chance to make any closing comments on the issue of neutrality, definitions, options, and implications. And again, many thanks to all of you who submit questions on Slido. Sorry we didn't get to more of them. A very brief closing comment. Roger, would you like to begin?
This whole event has happened, I think, quite successfully. There were people who objected to me attending because, you're not supposed to. But I think, to be fair, the way it's operated in the sections I've been to, it's worked well. And I think you could argue that's my concept of democracy in action, where you debate the issues that are facing us, either globally or nationally. I don't know what has to my throat. Maybe tell me to shut up. So maybe the next speaker then.
Bridget.
I think that the last 4 days, the 2 and now the 2, those 4 days we've had a more open, more deliberative discussion on what Ireland's security and defence policies should be in future. I think it has been a respectful debate. It has been a necessary debate, but we're just beginning. And I think we need to commit to continuing the discussion because we live in that very unsettling and unsettled world.
Thank you, Bridget. Dan?
I think there's some strain, not with Roger that I picked up today, but some strain of those who are pro-neutral that it is a morally superior position to be neutral. I think that is profoundly wrong. I think a decision around security and defence is about the national interest. It's not about being good neighbours. It's not about pleasing other people. It is about protecting ourselves. And neutrality, in my view, was the correct decision in the Second World War. Not one, for many reasons, we necessarily be hugely proud of, but it was the right decision for us. And I think we need to think about it not in moralistic terms, but what enhances the security of this country and its people, and that is the first priority to decide on that policy.
Thank you very much. I'd like to invite you to join me in thanking our panel, and as soon as the panel are finished, we're going to sit down, and then I'm going to invite the Tánaiste to offer concluding remarks on the forum. But first, if you join me in thanking our panel.
Chairperson Louise, and ladies and gentlemen, this has been quite the 4 days, and I've just actually come from Baldonnel, and where we launched the C295 at 230 million maritime surveillance aircraft, the largest acquisition yet for the Irish Defence Forces, which will dramatically and significantly increase our capability. But I thought, when I looked at, it's 230 for the one aircraft, there's a second one coming in September, which illustrates, I think someone made a point earlier, the expensive nature of improving and expanding our capability. And that's just one example of that. But we convened this forum so that we could embark on a national conversation on Ireland's international security policy. Not the only conversation, not a definitive conversation with formal decisions and outcomes, but a significant starting point, a first cut, an initial airing of the wide range of important and complex issues that together make up our security policy. We've heard from almost over 80 people over the 4 days with on-the-ground experience and expertise. And I'm going to thank them, each and every one of them, for their enormous contribution to this discussion. And we've heard from you, the people who have given up your time to come to join us in this discussion. I'm conscious, though, that in this short time, we've only scratched the surface of hearing the different perspectives, different viewpoints, and different lived experiences of all of you in this room and beyond. So I want everyone in this room and everyone watching online and everyone in this country with an interest and a point of view on any of the issues we've talked about today to also make a submission through the public consultation process. We purposely kept the process open for a number of weeks beyond the close of the forum so that people could listen to and absorb the discussions and reflect on what they have heard and then tell us what they think. I urge you all to do so through an online submission or through writing to us before the 7th of July. It has been a busy and intense 4 days. I'm not going to keep you for too much longer. But let me highlight 3 things that I have learned from this conversation. First, all of you here in this room, all of you who are in Galway or in Cork, all of you who have listened online, who have protested outside and sometimes inside, who have commented in the media, care passionately about this country. You care passionately about who we are as a people and as a country, about how we live our values and protect our interests through our foreign, security and defence policy, how we keep our people safe and secure, how we imbue all our international engagement with the core values that we hold as a people. And that gives me great hope. I draw great hope from it. And it gives me enormous confidence that we as a country and as a people can make the right choices and respond in a thoughtful and informed way to the deeply challenging and unpredictable international environment we face. We will have different views about exactly how to respond, what we should prioritise and focus on, how we should engage with partners internationally and on what issues, what our membership of the United Nations, the European Union, the OSCE, and our Partnership for Peace relationship with NATO does or should mean. That's good, and that's as it should be, and that's the lifeblood of democracy. The more debate we have on these issues, the better. Nobody should fear that debate or try and close it down. No one should fear thoughtful analysis or new ideas or hearing different viewpoints. That's exactly the type of conversation we aim to have at this forum. And I believe we've succeeded. And I want to keep that conversation and debate going. Second, the theme of the interconnected nature of this country has come through in every discussion across the 4 days. We are an island, but we are a global island. Our partnerships and relationships and linkages and interdependencies are baked into everything that we do and into all the choices that we make. Across the many, many different viewpoints and opinions expressed in the 4 days, I've heard almost no one argue for isolationism. In my opening address to the forum, I said that Ireland's policy of military neutrality did not mean that we should isolate ourselves or assume we have nothing to learn from or contribute to the wider debate about European security. I think we have tested and proved this hypothesis over the last 4 days. Yesterday, I was at the European Union Foreign Affairs Council meeting in Luxembourg, discussing events in Russia and Ukraine with other European Union foreign ministers. We heard from Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba, who joined us by video conference from Kyiv. Listening to him brought home to me just how unimaginable it would have seemed 2 years ago that our discussion here today would be taking place amidst a large-scale land war on the continent of Europe, that we would see the brutal and illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia and experience the largest displacement of people across the continent since World War II, that homes and schools and sports clubs and communities all over Ireland would be opening their doors to receive almost 90,000 Ukrainians fleeing this appalling conflict. But that is the reality that we face and experience. And as a country that wants to be at the heart of Europe and at the heart of European debates and decision-making, this is a reality that we have a responsibility to respond to, just as much as our partners in the Baltic states or in the other European Union member states geographically closer to Ukraine. Our connections, of course, are not just with European partners. So much of the conversation at the forum has been a reminder that Ireland has been and should continue to be at the centre of global efforts to tackle climate change, poverty and hunger, inequality and conflict. I've been heartened to hear of the pride that so many of you feel in our peacekeeping, or diplomacy, or development work, or support and solidarity to countries across the globe. That work will continue to be a fundamental, central part of our foreign, security and defence policy. Third, almost every discussion and every intervention across these 4 days has been underpinned by a clear and principled commitment to international law and the primacy of the United Nations Charter. I've always believed that the multilateral system, with the UN Charter at its heart, remains our strongest protection and our most important global security asset. As a militarily neutral country, our security, indeed our very existence as a sovereign state, relies on the compliance by all nations, however large and powerful, with the rules-based international order. Russia's war in Ukraine has been accompanied by its attempts to manipulate and paralyse the international multilateral system. We cannot ignore the reality that Russia's actions have emboldened those who would like to see a world where might is right, and that size and military power, rather than international law, governs how the world functions. As we saw with the cyber attack on the Health Service Executive, Ireland's geography and military neutrality did not protect us, and it will not protect us from future attempts. But this reality is an argument for more investment of our time, our energies, our commitment to multilateralism, not less. For continuing to take on leadership roles at the United Nations, as we did on the Security Council in 2021 and 2022, and as we are this year in co-facilitating the SDG Summit Declaration, at the Council of Europe through our presidency last year, at the OSCE, where we chair the Human Dimension Committee this year, and at the International Atomic Energy Agency, where we co-chair the Board of Governors, for continuing our proud record in peacekeeping and peacebuilding, including through the service of our defence forces overseas, for maintaining our place at the heart of Europe and driving the European Union agenda, for continuing our practical cooperation on capabilities, cyber security, the protection of critical undersea infrastructure, the interoperability of our defence forces, and other important areas through the Partnership for Peace programme and through the European Union's common security and defence policy. Let me finish by saying thank you. Thank you to all of you for being part of this conversation, to all of our great moderators and panellists, to the two departments I have the honour of leading, who have spent months planning for the forum and who have worked tirelessly throughout the proceedings to make this forum a success. Most of all, to our chair, Professor Louise Richardson, who has presided over proceedings with authority and with grace, and has brought her decades of experience and considerable intellect and knowledge to this process. An enormous thanks to you, Louise. You have shaped and set the tone of these 4 days, and I've watched you listen intently to every moment of this conversation. Your report will be an important contribution to this national conversation that will continue in the months and years ahead. I said when I opened this forum in Cork that discussions on Ireland's international security policy may sometimes seem esoteric or theoretical, but the implications of our choices are very important. Important for Ireland and for all of the people that share this precious island. I hope that these 4 days have shown that there is nothing theoretical about these issues. They matter. Navigating complex choices in an unpredictable world matters. Doing that from a baseline of facts and evidence matters. Doing that in a transparent and open way matters. All of us need, together, to be the architects of our international security policy. Go raibh míle maith agaibh go léir agus go naireoidh an tálamh.
Thank you very much, Tánaiste. It is the end of 4 very long days, so I promise to be extremely brief. I would really just like to add my thanks to those of the Tánaiste, to everyone who has made this possible, to the signers and the caterers and the tech team, the officials from both departments, and especially to those of you who suspected the motives of those of us organising this conference, those of you who found yourself in disagreement with what you felt to be the prevailing views here. I'm so thankful to you for participating, for expressing your views trenchantly and openly, and the whole forum is so much better because of your participation. It would have been so much easier to stay home and sit at the sidelines, and the fact that you came and engaged fully, I very much appreciate. Really, the Tánaiste has said it all, so I won't repeat the points he made. There were clear areas where there was some consensus, enormous pride in the roles of our peacekeepers, the roles of our officials overseas, a very strong sense that we need to invest more in our international security policy and the people who make it possible, the people who defend this country. And absolute unanimity around the fact that this is a deeply globalised country, deeply enmeshed overseas, and in all the wide range of views that were expressed overseas, there was no hint that this country should withdraw into itself. Rather, enormous pride in our global role, and pride in the fact that our global role is so much larger than indeed our size. The next step in this process is that I will write a report which I will submit to the Tánaiste and the government, in which I will analyse and synthesise the past few days, as well as the 300 plus submissions and any more that come in before the consultation closes on July 7th. So to those of you who felt a little frustrated that you weren't called upon, please submit to the consultation online. I can only say that I will endeavour and do my best to do justice to the calibre of the discussions that have taken place over the last few days. I have to say that I've been delighted to be involved in this process. When I was asked initially, I immediately said, I know of no other country that has done this. And yesterday we heard from representatives of 4 countries, including 2 that have made the seminal decision to join NATO. Each of them said that their country had no similar open consultative process. Switzerland apparently is about to start a conversation, and we heard yesterday that it was a committee of 20 people. So the fact that this government has taken what I believe to be a very courageous step and an admirable step of launching this conversation, and as has been said, this is just the first step in an ongoing conversation, I think is truly admirable, and I'm very grateful for the chance to have been a part of it. So with that, let me thank you again and invite everybody here to the Portrait Gallery for a reception. Thank you.